Before we get into the stories, I'm excited to announce I have a new channel called Monster Trail Cams. Here's a quick trailer for my new channel. The link is below. Monster Trail Cams is your ticket to the unseen and supernatural. Sourced from a vast network of mystery hunters worldwide, our channel reveals a collection of strange creatures and supernatural events that will leave you on the edge of your seat. From shadowy figures lurking in dense forests to inexplicable entities prowling under the cloak of night, each chilling clip peels back another layer of the world's untold mysteries. We release new episodes several times a week. Okay, now let's get to the stories. I always assumed it was just my own paranoia, but the more I investigated it, the more it became obvious that it was worse than anything I originally imagined. This happened on the same street I used to work on about 5 years ago. Now, this was in a not-so-good part of Philadelphia, and the place had always given me the creeps. It just looked like it was harboring some sort of sinister secret. I should mention that I worked for an affordable mobile service provider in the city. My job was to cold call people whose contracts with our competitors were about to run out, and I'd offer them our cheaper service. It wasn't the greatest job, but it taught me a lot about sales and human nature, and it paid the bills. At the end of every workday, when I'd walk to my car, I would pass the abandoned building and I would try to peek through the windows, but the entire building was seemingly empty and unused except for the top floor. The top floor's light would always be on. I never saw anyone enter or leave that building, and the entire thing was falling apart. I was amazed it wasn't condemned by the city, but someone was clearly paying the rent or mortgage to be there. Despite it being in rough shape, it had to be expensive. It was a huge old building, and it even had the original stone gargoyle at the top that looked straight down at you. One night, I'd forgotten my phone at work, and I called my boss hoping he was still at the office, and thank goodness he was. So I headed to the office, and he was waiting outside with my phone in his hand. He gave me the phone, I thanked him and started walking back to my car. When I was almost there, I heard the most horrific screams coming from the top floor of the abandoned building. I was seriously freaked out, and I stood there and listened for a while. It sounded like someone was torturing this guy. You could hear the anguish and pain in his screams. Then he yelled, "No, please!" and the screaming continued for several minutes. Then it was completely silent. A few moments later, 2 men in sunglasses and suits burst through the front door. I started getting in my car, trying to be as nonchalant as possible. The 2 men immediately got into a black car with dark windows that was parked across the street, and they took off down the road. I sat in my car for a while trying to regain my composure, and eventually drove home. When I got home that night, I tried to give myself a reasonable explanation for the screams. Maybe the guy's wife was divorcing him over the phone. Maybe someone he loved dearly died in a tragic way. But I knew those were far-fetched thoughts and that there was no rationalizing the sound of those cries. It had to be severe physical pain, and I can only imagine that the man probably died. The 2 suited men were clearly torturous murderers. I just hoped they didn't come back for me to eliminate the witness. I tried to forget about it and go to sleep, but that guy's screams weighed heavily on me. I wondered if I should call the cops, but I've seen plenty of movies about what happens to the guy that calls the cops after witnessing a murder. I didn't know what to do and was completely freaked out. I decided to go back and sit down at a 24-hour diner that was very near the creepy building and see if anything else went down that night. I got a coffee and a sandwich and sat by the window to see if I could make out any details of that top floor. The light was still on and I could see some movement in there, but that's about it. Suddenly, the same black car pulled up and parked right in front of the diner. The 2 men, still in suits and sunglasses, got out. But this time they walked into the restaurant. I was in shock and now really wishing I just stayed at home. The waitress asked them to follow her, but one of the men said that they were going to sit at the table next to me and asked for 2 coffees. The waitress went into the back and the 2 men never did sit, and they proceeded to stand right next to my table. I just stared at my coffee and tried to pretend that I didn't see them. Finally, one of them tapped me on the shoulder and threw an envelope on the table. "You didn't hear anything tonight, did you?" I couldn't speak. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. The guy cleared his throat and said, "I need to hear you say it." I looked at the men and said, "I didn't hear anything." The two guys sat down across from me at my booth, looked right at me. "You didn't tell anybody about hearing nothing tonight, did you?" I was shaking, but I tried to look as normal as possible. I said, "Absolutely not. Nothing to tell, nobody to tell it to." Both guys then laughed, and one of them threw a business card at me. He said, "Give me a call sometime, kid." The card was just a phone number, with no names or words on it at all. They then got up from my booth, and one of them pointed to the envelope. "That's your first one," he said, and they both sat down at their booth. I immediately put money down on the table for the coffee and sandwich, said bye to the men in suits, and walked out of the restaurant as nonchalantly as possible. As soon as I thought I wasn't in eyeshot anymore, I sprinted the rest of the way to my car. I immediately quit my job at the mobile service provider, moved out of my apartment within 2 weeks, and eventually found another one on the other side of the city. I haven't told many people about this, and it's been a while now since it happened. But still, I've never been to that part of Philly since. I was really freaked out by this, and I hope everyone listening learns from my experience. There are some places you shouldn't go after dark. I was camping with my friends a few weeks ago, a guy's weekend at Killiansburg Cave campground. That's on the C&O Canal in Sharpsburg, Maryland. I moved here from Maine in junior high, and me and my friends have all been in and out of these caves a million times before. Not the big touristy ones. I'm talking about the ones that haven't been turned into attractions. This area has a lot of small caves, and if you grew up here, you'd know that's a primo place to party. We're all freshmen in college now, and even though we go to different schools from each other, we still try to hang out at least once during the summer. Killiansburg Cave Campground is a good place to get together because it's off-road. You have to hike in over a mile from the nearest parking lot. Plus, you can have a group of tents at one site. So that's why we chose it. Everything was going great until my buddy Tim started getting antsy. We were all sitting around the fire drinking beer just before 10 that night. I was okay with staying right where I was, because me and my friend Richie had brought our mountain bikes and we'd been out all afternoon. I was a little beat, but it felt good to hang out and just chill. Tim started talking about the good old days and how we used to party in Killiansburg Cave years ago. It's not a seriously huge cave, but it has a cool history. During the Civil War, a bunch of townspeople hid out in there when the battle came to Sharpsburg. Since the cave hasn't been made into a commercial attraction, you can go explore it by yourself for free. We used to skip school sometimes and hang out in there and get drunk. The cave is about a half mile away from the campsite, maybe less. So after Tim went on about it for a few minutes, he managed to convince Brian and Richie. I didn't want to just sit there by myself, so I went along with it. We threw some beer into a day pack and headed down the trail. The moon was about half full, and it was plenty bright, but we had 2 flashlights with us just in case. It only took about 10 minutes or so to get there, and no one else was around. The cave opening is pretty tall, maybe 20 feet high, or just under, and it slopes downhill on the inside. It's not that big, really, even though the old stories make it sound like thousands of people hid out in there. So we get inside, and Richie passes out the beer. Brian lit up a cigarette, and we just chilled for a while, talking about nothing mostly, just hanging out. Then, of course, Tim gets all fidgety and grabs one of the flashlights, walking around, checking things out. I didn't pay him much attention until I heard a cracking sound. We all turned around, and Tim was at the back of the cave, smacking a big rock against the wall. Brian asked him what the hell he was doing, and Tim said he could see another passage through a hole in the wall. We've all been in there like a million times before, and I've never seen anything but the one room, so I thought he was imagining it. I went over to where he was whacking the rock and took a look myself. He was right. There was a big crack where part of the wall had crumbled since the last time we'd been there. It was a small opening, but you could see where it opened up on the other side. Tim lifted up his rock to whack it again, but Brian had a better idea. He thought there was probably another entrance hidden in the brush on the outside, where the cave wall kind of rounded a curve. There's another cave nearby called Snyders, which has 3 separate openings, so he made a good point. And it sounded way better than Tim smacking a rock against a wall and maybe bringing the ceiling down on us. We decided to take a look. We left the backpack with the leftover beer right there on the cave floor, since we weren't planning to go far. Tim took one of the flashlights and I grabbed the other, and all 4 of us started exploring the rock face to the right of Killiansburg Cave, pushing aside the bushes and stuff, looking for another entrance. I was about to call it quits after 5 minutes or so. I wasn't having fun anymore. It seemed kind of dumb. I wanted to just catch a buzz, sit around the fire with the guys and talk about crazy things. Besides, it would make a lot more sense to check this out during the daytime. Just when I decided to say that, Tim yelled, he found something. I went up to where he was and shined my light too. There was an opening about 4 feet wide and maybe 5.5 feet high. Pretty narrow. Tim stuck his head in to look and said it was big enough for us to stand up inside. He was all gung-ho to go explore it, but the rest of us were like, whatever. Finally, Tim gave up trying to convince us and just handed his beer to Richie to hold. He told me to shine my light on the ceiling while he was going through and yell if I saw any bats. He shined his own light at the cave floor in case there were any snakes. I don't know why he had to go in there, what he was trying to prove, but I just said, okay. Tim squeezed through the opening, ducking his head, and then he stood up straight. What do you see? I asked. I kept my flashlight trained on the ceiling but didn't see any bats. Not much. He turned in a circle and his light bounced off the cave walls. It smells really bad in here, like a hot spring. Sulfur smell. I didn't like hearing that. What if there were toxic gases in there? Don't light a match, I joked. Then I said, why don't you come on back out? But he wasn't done. In a minute, there's a tunnel at the back. It probably leads to the main cavern. I could see Tim's light shining into this dark tunnel. Then all of a sudden, the beam reflected on twin circles, shining yellow. Animal eyes. I yelled to him, saying, there's something in the tunnel, but he'd already seen it. Holy cow. Tim spun back around, scrambling to get out of the cave. His flashlight shone right in my eyes for a second, blinding me. Then my blood just froze because I heard him scream. I stumbled back, blinking my eyes, really freaking out because I couldn't see anything but spots for a second. I couldn't run if I had to. I was afraid Tim was getting mauled by a bear. My eyes started working again, and I saw Tim was okay. He was squeezing back through the opening with Brian and Richie helping him, pulling him through. Tim's eyes were terrified. I've never seen him look so scared. We all started talking at once, asking what had happened, but he just turned and shone his light back through the opening. His hand was shaking. I don't know. Something grabbed me, he said. Something was in that tunnel, and when I turned my back on it, it grabbed my sweatshirt, almost pulled me off my feet. Was it a... Richie started to say, but then I hushed him, shining my light inside, with Tim's. Caught in the twin beams, you could see some sort of creature. It had come out of the tunnel, and now it was watching us. I moved my light up to its face and almost dropped my flashlight. It looked like the boogeyman from a little kid's nightmare. It wasn't human, but it stood like a man on 2 legs. Its head looked like a goat's head, but bigger and longer, with yellow snake eyes and curving horns. Its neck was long, like a horse's, but its body was more like a lizard. A really big lizard. I would guess it weighed over 100 pounds. The way the light reflected on it made me think it had scales. Then it shifted sideways, and I saw the wings. Folded down wings like a bat. Wings, horns, a sulfur smell. I'm not superstitious, but this creature had to be some sort of demon. We got to get out of here now, I yelled and started running down the path. I didn't care if they followed or not. That thing was definitely not from this earth. Everyone had seen at least a glimpse of it just then, so no one argued. No one mentioned the beer we'd left in the main cave. We just hauled ass for the campsite. It wasn't until we got back to our site and lit the lanterns that we noticed Tim's jacket. On the fold of the hood, the cloth was shredded, like something had clawed it. He took it off and we all examined it, not realizing until that moment what a close call he'd had. None of us slept that night and we didn't drink any more beer. We just sat around the campfire, keeping watch. I told my girlfriend about it, and she thinks it was the Jersey Devil, even though we're in Maryland. I never used to believe in any of those creature stories, but there's something there, all right? Something's living in the caves near Sharpsburg, Maryland. I'll never go in there at night again. Back in the day, I lived in a small town in southwestern Ohio, and I used to like to explore some of the abandoned buildings in the oldest part of town, and we saw some really wild stuff. The craziest experience we had, though, and the reason we stopped exploring, happened in this abandoned church a block or two up from the railroad tracks. On that day, there were 4 of us, 2 boys and 2 girls. We brought our usual tools for gathering paranormal evidence, but this time we brought a Ouija board and some other random items with us as well. Things like a deck of cards, a yo-yo, and a compass. This was 1978, mind you, and I honestly wasn't the biggest believer in the spirit world, but I did enjoy the ambiance of it all and watching my friends get freaked out. But I became a believer the night we went into that church. This church was well over 100 years old, built in the 1800s and was falling apart. We broke the lock on it, which wasn't really all that hard, and stepped inside. We were planning on spending the whole night there. We all climbed onto the dusty old church pews, and after a bit of coughing and sneezing, sat in silence to see if we could pick up on anything. My friend Eddie sensed some energy, but the rest of us didn't feel much of anything. Honestly, Eddie thought just about everything was haunted. We lit some candles around the sanctuary to start things up. We started asking questions in the church to get some activity moving. We called out to the congregation, the priest, the choir members, anything we could think of. None of us were the church-going type, so we did the best we could to think of things to ask. And then, when we asked if there were any children in there, one of the candles went out. We looked at each other with a bit of surprise, as I don't think any of us were really expecting anything to happen. And then we shifted our focus to trying to communicate with the children. Christina pulled the yo-yo out of her bag and sat it on the piano, and we all moved back from it. I asked, "Children, would you like to play?" The yo-yo moved around a bit, which was enough for Eddie, of course, to freak out. But the rest of us weren't totally convinced, and we wanted something a little more solid. It was an old building. It could have been anything that moved it. My friend Christina asked, "Children, was that you who moved the yo-yo?" As soon as she said that, the yo-yo fell off the piano. Now, that was pretty freaky. Eddie was ready to leave, but the rest of us wanted to stay there and get as much evidence as possible that this was real. We kept asking questions in the main room for a while, but all of the movement had stopped. So we decided to split up and explore around the other rooms a bit. Eddie stayed in the sanctuary. Christina went into the kitchen in the basement. Ashley went into the basement, and I went into the priest's office. The office was creepy, especially with just the light from my flashlight. I went over to the old desk and sat down in his chair. I wiped off the dust from the desk and started looking through the drawers. There was a Bible, a notebook, some writing utensils, and a bunch of papers. The Bible was pretty cool, and I thought to myself that I'd be able to use it as an object to incite some activity on future adventures. The notebook had writings in it about the consequences of sins and several Bible notes to drive the point home. It was a strange thing to read, really, but my thoughts were soon interrupted when I heard Ashley scream. I stopped what I was doing and headed into the kitchen. When I asked her what happened, she said that something threw a glass at her. We shined our flashlights down at the ground and saw the shattered glass all over the floor. We started snapping pictures all around the broken glass to see if we could capture some orbs. We then got the Ouija board out of my backpack and put it down on the ground and lit some candles around it. If something was powerful enough to throw a glass, it was probably powerful enough to communicate with us as well. We kept asking for the children, but there was no activity yet coming from the Ouija board. We began asking it questions about the kitchen, the glass if someone didn't like Ashley, etc. No activity whatsoever. But when we were about to move on to another room and try there, one of the candles went out. This also happened to be the candle closest to a cross that was hanging on the wall. We asked it what it wanted, and finally the Ouija board moved and spelled out Bible. I instantly thought of the Bible I had just seen and ran back to the priest's office, grabbed everything, and ran back into the kitchen. I placed the Bible next to the Ouija board. We started asking whatever was talking to us through the board, religious questions. Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? What is our purpose in life? What happens when we die? These didn't incite any activity. Nothing moved at all in response. So I went over to the notebook and started reading off the writings on the pages. Suddenly, the Ouija board moved to 3, then 1, then 4. I looked down at the notebook and saw Genesis 3:14. Eddie flipped the Bible open to the passage and read it aloud. So the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." It was at this point we were all freaked out and figured it was best to get out of there. We started to gather up everything we brought in and started heading out of the church. And that's when another glass smashed behind us in the kitchen, and we ran. As soon as we got out of the church and to the bottom of the front steps, we stopped to catch our breath. Before anyone could say anything, we heard what sounded like a music box playing and children laughing, coming from inside the front doors. We got the hell out of there as quickly as possible. After a night like this, there was no more denying the existence of the paranormal for me. The places we visited before that night, we might have gotten a few pieces of evidence, but that church was absolutely haunted. The yo-yo falling, the glasses being thrown, the Ouija board spelling Bible, and then Genesis 3:14. That was by far the most evidence we got from a single location, and it was all in a matter of 4 hours. To this day, I always wonder if we stayed there, would we have gotten hurt? Later, once we developed the pictures and looked them over, we all agreed that we had captured a couple of orbs in the kitchen. I was honestly surprised we didn't capture anything else, though. I mean, I was half expecting to see a demon's face somewhere based on everything that happened. I guess, in a way, I'm happy we didn't. So I recently moved back to Philly for a job. I'm a few blocks down from my parents' place. My mom and dad are getting up there in years, so I've been spending a lot of time helping them fix some things in their house. Now, a problem my parents have had for as long as I can remember is getting the trash truck to come. Half the houses on their block have been either abandoned or condemned by the city. And the sanitation department will sometimes take their house off the trash route by accident. It's a headache, and it means trash can pile up on our sidewalk for weeks sometimes. So what happened was, about 2 months ago, garbage started piling up again. And to make matters worse, we were throwing out more junk than usual because of the repairs, so our sidewalk was cluttered, and our bins were full. One morning, my dad gets up and sees that one of the trash bins was destroyed. My parents used those heavy-duty bins with the animal locks to keep the raccoons out. But this bin had its lid completely ripped off, and everything inside had spilled onto the street. My dad was so upset. That particular can had been used for our kitchen garbage, so it had old leftovers and food scraps. We figured maybe an animal smelled it and it was too good to pass up. I was annoyed, but I didn't think too much of it. None of us did. It was just a trash can, so it wasn't that big a deal. But then our trash bins kept getting broken into, even when they were pulled off the street and it wasn't trash day. And some of them had dents like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them. Of course, any bags we left out for pickup on pickup day were ripped open. Our street smelled and looked disgusting on those days. When the trash guys came, it was so bad they couldn't even collect anything. Those guys weren't picking stuff up off the street. This went on for roughly a few weeks, and my mom had had enough. She was completely fed up. She kept asking the neighbors if they had seen anything or anyone out there, and they all said no. At that point, she thought maybe someone had it out for us and was trying to send a message. She called the sanitation department to ask for extra pickups, and they said no. Their trucks weren't available to do that. So it looked like no one was going to help us fix this. So I decided to go to the store and get one of those motion sensor floodlights. I got it, I set it up, and I put it on the house above the sidewalk in front of the house. It was pointed at the trash cans. So my dad and I decided to stay up on a Friday night and see if we could catch the culprit. And around midnight, we heard the first noise. We heard a crash. And we both saw the floodlight turn on, and we could see that the noise was coming from one of the trash cans. Something huge and furry was tearing into it. I hoped the spotlight would scare it away, but it didn't budge. It was too dark to see anything else except the animal's silhouette, but I knew that it had to be bigger than I was. Everything about it just seemed big and muscular. It looked like it could tear apart anything it wanted to. I didn't want to go out there, and neither did my dad. But we had to do something. My dad grabbed a block of wood that was still inside from the repairs, opened the door, and chucked it at the animal as hard as he could. It barely moved when it got hit, but it did look up. And I'm telling you, it had the face of a dog. One of those skinny, mean ones, too. Its eyes even reflected the light like a dog's. My dad picked up another block and threw it, and this time the animal ran off down the street. We closed the door and waited. When we were absolutely sure that it wasn't coming back, we went outside to inspect the damage. Everything smelled like urine and sulfur. And now that we knew what we were up against, things started to make sense. It liked our kitchen trash the best. Even though it obviously wasn't one, it seemed to eat like a raccoon. It was a scavenger. The next day I picked up some rat poison. Before, we'd been hesitant to use it because we didn't want to accidentally kill someone's pet. But now, we just wanted to drive the creature away without getting hurt ourselves. Over the next 2 days, I mixed the poison in with our garbage, and I made sure to sleep over at my parents' house just in case. We set the trash out for the night, turned the floodlights on, and hoped for the best. Everything was a mess in the morning, just like we expected. We figured we wouldn't be able to tell if our plan worked for at least a few days. So when I set our garbage out again a few days after that, I worried that I'd find the same thing as before. But nothing was touched. Our bins were fine, and this time all was exactly where I'd left them. And it's been like that ever since. Either this creature moved on or he's dead. Either way, he's gone from our house. I don't tell many people this story, but something wild happened to me and my friends when we were camping one night. My buddies and I would throw these raging house parties back in the day. I was a DJ, and I had this amazing sound setup that used to tear the house down. I'm talking about a huge high-end PA system that would get loud enough for a stadium. I had all kinds of crazy lights, fog machines, and visual effects that would turn any dingy apartment into an instant rave. My buddy Jeff could whip out professional quality drinks at an amazing rate. My man Kyle had this omelet station and would whip out the most delicious breakfast foods all night long. Casey was our other roommate, and she was always the life of the party. The morning after one of the craziest parties we've ever thrown, the four of us were in awful shape. We all desperately needed to recuperate, but many of the partygoers were planning on showing up again. So we figured that we would just head out and go camping deep in the woods and hide out for a while. We gathered all our supplies and headed on down the road. We found a nice secluded spot in the middle of the woods and set up a sweet campsite. We ended up having such a good time that night that we figured we'd stay the whole weekend. The last night, we were grilling some hot dogs around the fire, relaxing and just having the best time. Suddenly, we heard this whooping noise coming from the forest. We thought we had been completely alone all weekend, so this freaked us all out. After sitting and listening for a while, Kyle got up and grabbed a flashlight. "Come on, let's find whatever's out there," he said, as he headed towards the sounds. "Let's just get out of here," Casey said, taking off after Kyle. Jeff and I looked at each other and headed off after them, flashlights in hand. We slowly crept through the woods towards the whooping sounds. As the sounds got louder, we turned off our flashlights and snuck closer. We saw the fire from a campsite peeking through the trees and slowly made our way towards the light. What we saw horrified us. There were naked human-like things with unnaturally white skin, large black eyes, and skinny long limbs. They were jumping around the fire, whooping and shouting. There must have been 20 of them. One of us stepped on a branch and they all went silent and looked right at us. All 4 of us took off back towards our campsite, screaming and panicking. Whatever those things were started whooping and shouting at us as they chased us back to the campsite. "Run! Come on, let's go!" We screamed at each other. We left everything we had brought and sprinted towards the van. We all climbed in and shouted at Casey to start the van up. She patted her pockets and froze. She had left the keys at the campsite. We locked the doors and looked in the direction the creatures were coming from. The whooping and shouting got louder and louder, and then it was silent. We watched for a while and didn't see any of the creatures anymore. We had to go back and get the keys. There was no way around it. It was too dangerous and too far to try to leave the forest on foot. That was a truly terrifying walk back. The forest was dead quiet. We got back to our campsite and looked around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We searched for the keys for a while, and finally Casey found them in her sleeping bag. We pretty much left everything we brought and ran towards the van. We all piled in the van and Casey started it up. The headlights came on, and we saw the creatures had us surrounded. All of them stood equal lengths apart from each other and stared right at us. They all looked dead and emotionless. We thought we were about to die. After a couple of tense minutes, Casey rolled down the window and shouted, "We're leaving now. We're never coming back. We'll never speak of this. Just let us go." None of them moved at all, and we just sat there. Suddenly, Casey slammed the van in gear and floored it straight towards the road ahead. We were about to hit one of the creatures ahead, and we were all screaming our heads off. As the car got towards it, the creature bent backward, and the van didn't even scratch it. We sped off, and I looked back at all the creatures just blankly staring at us, make a beeline down the road. As we approached the exit, we could see the creatures looking down at us from the top of the trees. I thought they were going to jump down and kill us, but we made our way safely onto the highway and never saw them again. My life has calmed down a lot since those days, thankfully. My children have asked me several times to take them camping, but I haven't been in the woods since this experience. I honestly don't think I'll ever go camping again, as I have post-traumatic stress from this incident. My college friends and I have fallen out of touch, but writing this down has inspired me to try to reach back out to them. I want to see how their lives turned out and what they think of that night all these years later. I don't know what those creatures were, but I know they weren't human, and I know I never want to see them ever again. In hindsight, as soon as we heard the whooping noises, we should have gotten out of there immediately. But at least I have this crazy story to tell, and we all made it out of there alive. I wonder how many people have encountered these creatures and not lived to talk about them. I'm a huge believer in the paranormal, and I feel that if everyone experienced some of the things I have, they would be too. I'm a huge believer that any negative environment can become a portal into the spirit world if there is enough pain and trauma present. I don't think that energy goes away. I think locations hold on to the energy of everything that occurs there like a sponge. I didn't think that way as a child. I was raised by particularly non-religious parents. But after you have a few profound experiences, you can't forget them and they become part of you. I used to work as a janitor at a psychiatric hospital in eastern Pennsylvania. The place was just eerie in general, and unexplainable things would always happen. I'll talk about the experiences that freaked me out the most, but I could honestly write a book about all the things that happened there. Seeing shadow people move around, doors opening by themselves, objects falling off shelves, and constantly having supplies stolen were just about everyday occurrences. One day I was cleaning one of the bathrooms and felt a strong, menacing presence. I tried to ignore it and kept mopping the floors, but the feeling grew stronger and stronger. Finally, the tightness in my chest got to the point where I needed to address it. I asked if there was anybody in the bathroom with me. Immediately, all 6 of the sinks turned on. I put my hands up and shouted, "All right, that's enough, come on now." As soon as I said that, they all turned off. I tried to rationalize it as a sensor issue, so I said, "I bet you can't turn on just one." Without missing a beat, one of the faucets turned on full blast. I grabbed my stuff and moved on to the next room without finishing the bathroom. That was just way too much. I told my boss about the experience, and he leaned in close and told me I should never try to communicate with them. He said it often makes the situation worse. He said it's best to pretend they don't exist, and they'll leave you alone. They never left me alone, though. The spirits in that place probably fed off my fear. From the first day on the job, I knew that place was seriously haunted. I felt bad for the patients there. How could you possibly find sanity in an environment like that? One night, I was cleaning the offices in the bottom floor of the hospital, which is the same floor that the morgue was in. It was only me working down there at the time, and I saw this white-haired woman in white clothes running down the hall, towards the morgue, which was at the end of the hallway. I yelled at her that she couldn't be down here and it was a restricted area, but she kept running. She slammed through the morgue doors, and I took off after her, yelling at her to stop. When I got inside the morgue, there was not another living soul in there. I looked all over the place for her, but there was nobody in there. I got the hell out of there, and I will never forget that. I don't know if that was the spirit of a patient or a nurse, but either way, she was not at peace. I got pretty close with some of the patients there, and one of them claimed that they saw the white-haired woman all of the time. He was able to describe her in vivid detail exactly as I had seen her. That absolutely made my skin crawl. The absolute craziest thing happened to me late one night towards the end of my shift, and this is the thing that ended it all. I quit the job immediately after this. A patient had just died, and I was cleaning out her room. The electronics in there were going nuts. The TV kept turning on, the lights were flickering, my vacuum kept turning off. It was just chaos. I had just about given up cleaning that room altogether and was about to leave when the door slammed shut in my face. I was terrified and the room was completely dark. I was trying to feel around for the light switch when I heard a woman's voice say, "Where do you think you're going?" I froze and could hardly breathe. I said to her, "Look, I'm just trying to finish my shift and go home." She laughed and said, "You're not going home." I kept feeling around for something to defend myself with, and I asked her, "Where am I going then?" The lights then came back on, and I saw the same patient who had died. She was over by the window. She was staring at me and said as clear as day, "You're coming with me." I booked it out of there. I had already been seriously considering quitting, but this drove me over the edge. No paycheck is worth that kind of abuse, and life is too short to constantly worry about your safety. The strange thing was that when that patient was alive, she was always nice to me and seemed like a gentle lady. Maybe she had secret fantasies of killing me, but other than scaring the living hell out of me, this also hurt my feelings. If you're going to wish somebody harm, at least do it to their face and not behind their back. I don't know, though, if I had lived in a place like that for years, I would probably wish ill on people too. One thing's for sure, I'm so grateful I never have to go to that place ever again. The way I live my life now, if something feels off, I'm out of there. I've learned my lesson. We were given our senses to survive, and I honestly believe that if I stayed at that job, I would be dead, even if it was just from the stress and anxiety. I hope for anyone out there who has a job that makes their life miserable, you quit before your life passes you by. It was scary for me to leave that paycheck, and I had to move and do a lot of things to find another job, but I don't fear for my life all the time as I used to do. So this thing happened to me right at the beginning of that baby formula shortage. I don't know if you heard about it, but it was nearly impossible to find formula anywhere. And my baby was just 4 months old at the time, so I was desperate to get out there and find some. Every store I went to was completely out, just empty shelf after empty shelf. I went online to see if maybe I could find a recipe for formula. You know there are recipes, but then you read that making your own can be bad for the baby. Some even say dangerous because the ratio of water to nutrients, everything, is really precise in formula. I saw that the only short-term option aside from formula was canned evaporated milk, easy for babies to digest, so I thought that could be a backup. After I'd exhausted every avenue to find formula, the pediatrician, birthing centers, hospitals, calling every parent I could think of, nobody had anything extra to spare, and I couldn't afford to buy the breast milk that was being offered for sale. Then I saw this ad pop up on Facebook Marketplace, a picture of a case of formula sitting on top of a tall shelving unit. I messaged the guy, and he said he'd hold it for me. Says his adult daughter had a bunch of extra for her baby, who's a toddler now. She had put it in a storage unit last year and forgot about it. He asks if I'm tall because it's stored up high and he lost his legs and is in a wheelchair. I say, sure, I can do it myself, no problem, and I put a step stool in my car just in case. I leave the baby with my mom and the last few portions of formula I have left, planning to be back within an hour or so. I was feeling a tiny bit of relief, knowing that I'd soon have formula in my hands, but I was just eager to get it back. It's about a 30-minute drive from my place up near the airport. It started to look very industrial as I got closer to the storage facility. Once I pulled up to it, I entered the gate code the guy gave me and went in. The guy is waiting for me in his pickup. He waved to me and I drove up alongside and he says, "Can you go in on your own?" and handed me a small key that will unlock the padlock. He added that there is usually a loose guard dog on the premises and that he's a little scared of dogs, being in a chair and all. He says, "So just watch out." Well, I have 2 German Shepherds myself and dogs usually like me, so I wasn't worried. I parked, got out, and remembered to grab my step stool. And then, before I head in, I hear the dog he's talking about, panting. I remember I've got these dog treats in my glove box, so I real quick grab a few and put them in my hoodie pocket. Then I walk over and open the padlock and lift the door to the unit. Enough light spills in so I can see that the back wall is a storage shelf, and there's the formula from the photo. I push myself between rows of random boxes and get to the back. I reach up as high as I can but can barely brush my fingertips against it. So I set my step stool down. Next, I heard the dog again. I looked around but didn't see one. I whistled a couple of times. Then I noticed the guy and his truck were gone. It suddenly all seemed strange, and I get this eerie feeling about being there by myself. He left, but I hadn't even paid him. But I'm there for formula, and I'm determined to get it. So I quickly walk in, climb the stool, grab the formula, and head back out. As I'm doing this, I notice a reflection of eyes coming out from this tall ficus tree outside of the unit. I take a long second to study it. It could be a person messing with me, but the silhouette reminds me of a T-Rex. I even think maybe it's a statue of a T-Rex that someone was storing and just abandoned it when they emptied their unit. In any case, I'm not sticking around to find out. The hairs on my arms rise. I slam the unit door shut behind me and hear the key fall to the ground, but I just run to my truck, holding on to that formula. I scramble into my truck and lock it. When I turn around, I see that the storage unit door is only about halfway down, and what looks like this long lizard tail is sticking out of the storage unit. Whatever that was, I don't know how, but it seemed to have opened the door and was in there, rooting through boxes, knocking stuff over. Now I had to drive by the unit again. I had no choice because I was pulled up at the end of an area that was a dead end. So I just stepped on the gas and flew by it in reverse, and I heard the creature let out this god-awful screech. I can still hear it. I somehow drove home, and I was just shaking. The guy from FB Marketplace is nowhere to be found. I messaged him, texted him to Venmo, and nothing, no response. To this day, he's never returned my messages. I feel like, someone was playing a sick joke on me. Or maybe I'd somehow been tricked into being bait. I mean, that's how it felt, As for the formula, it was sealed, just shy of expiring. I didn't have a choice but to feed it to my baby. After that ran out, I figured evaporated milk would be just fine until the stores stocked up with formula again. When my baby is old enough, maybe I'll tell her this story. It sure is crazy what we'll do for our kids. After a crazy weekend in Vegas with some college friends, I was driving home to California. It was a pretty boring drive, especially at night, but I took my turn behind the wheel and put on the cruise control while my two friends slept, one in the passenger seat and one sprawled out in the back. I'd had a pretty good run at the casino, so I was combating middle-of-the-night highway hypnosis by thinking about how I was going to spend my winnings. I was trying to decide between a new couch and a new TV, when suddenly the entire car was filled with light. My first thought was that some jerk in a hopped-up truck had managed to come flying up behind me, but that didn't make sense. The landscape was so flat and featureless that there was no way I wouldn't have seen another vehicle approaching. My second thought was that we were being pulled over. That didn't make sense either. Where could a cop car possibly have been waiting out of sight to bust speeders or drunk drivers? I was so blinded by the bright light that I couldn't even see the highway in front of me. I slowed down, eventually coming to a stop in what I assumed was the middle of the road. Both of my friends started stirring, and I heard one of them say, "What's going on?" as I opened the car door and stepped out. The light was even brighter outside of the car. It was almost punishing. I looked around frantically, desperate to find the source. Was this some kind of trap designed to rip people off on their way outside of Vegas? I heard one of the car doors open, then the second, then one of my friends started screaming. I whirled around and his head was craned back at what looked like an unnatural angle. He was trapped in a beam of light. It was light green, different than the light that surrounded us. He looked frozen. His arm was extended, his index finger pointed straight up. I followed the angle, and then I started screaming too. It filled the entire sky. I couldn't even see the edges of it. It extended as far as I could see in every direction. My mind kept rejecting what I knew was happening. My brain just couldn't accept that I was seeing a UFO. I couldn't see what kind of material it was made of. All I could see were unending miles of blinking lights. I looked at my friend John, who was standing by the passenger door. His face mirrored the expression I felt on my own. Complete disbelief, shock, and fear. Eric was still trapped in the beam of light. He wasn't moving at all, but he was still screaming. John and I both clamped our hands over our ears as the beam of light changed and filled up with what looked like bubbles swarming around Eric's whole body. The bubbles were moving independently, but quite a few of them clustered around his head, while others circled around his body. As we watched in horror, a new sound filled the air. It sounded like a scanner at the grocery store, high-pitched beeping that increased in volume every second. I was fighting every nerve that was screaming at me to run. Where could I possibly hide? The desert is deadly at night, and as soon as the sun came up, I would be in danger of heat stroke. And that was assuming that I managed to escape whatever was piloting that UFO. But John had a different idea. He turned and ran at top speed, which wasn't very fast with the sand dragging around his feet. He was about 40 feet from the road when another beam of light shot out of the UFO and pinned him in place. It was the same color as the one holding Eric prisoner, and it quickly filled up with the same kind of bubbles that had John trapped. The high-pitched beeping sounded doubled. I assumed that it was only a matter of time before I got my own beam of light. I closed my eyes and waited. After what seemed like an eternity, the beeping finally stopped. I opened my eyes. John and Eric were both lying on the ground. I looked up and all I could see was wide open sky. Eric was sitting up by the time I got to him, and I looked over to see John struggling to stand. I helped them both up one by one and got them back to the car. Neither of them had any memory of anything after we checked out of our hotel. I told them what happened, but of course they didn't believe me. They both decided that they had overdone it on the booze. Or maybe their last drinks had been drugged. They conveniently overlooked the fact that both of them had been out of the car because they couldn't explain that part. But I know what really happened. I'll never forget it. But when we did actually get pulled over a few hours later, it was because I was driving like a bat out of hell to get that desert as far behind us as possible. I'll get straight to it. I think I saw a Mothman last year. My sister was there with me, but she swears up and down that that is not what happened. I think she's avoiding admitting it because she's too scared. So what happened was this. Me, my sister Charlotte, and our parents were on vacation. We were staying at my uncle's house near Los Angeles. He lives in a busy area, and there are a lot of new developments going on around his neighborhood. Specifically, he is only a few minutes away from this giant new housing community that's going up. Anyway, Charlotte is a real health nut, and she liked to take the dogs and go jogging at night, and I would usually go with her. Sometimes we'd jog past the housing development because I thought it was cool, all the frames for the houses and contracting equipment sitting around and stuff. It was quiet and we always had our phones on us, so it felt pretty safe. We had been doing this routine for a few nights, and it was fun to see the changes that were being completed each day on the buildings. But then, strangely, on the day this happened, I think a random Thursday, the streets were even emptier than usual. Anyway, we were jogging along when all of a sudden our dog stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. He started barking and growling and really straining at the leash, trying to pull us in the direction he was growling. And he was never like that. He never barks or really misbehaves. So there's me and Charlotte stopped in our tracks and trying to drag him away from whatever has got him freaked out so we can get him back home. But he's really freaking out. And he's a strong dog, so it's taking both of us and all our might to keep him in one place and not let him pull himself out of our hands. I followed his line of sight to try and see what was setting him off. And at first I think he's barking at the house itself. Then I realize he's actually looking above it, up towards the sky, so I look there. I can't see anything really, but it's it's never fully dark, right? I thought maybe he saw a falcon or something that looked like it was too close. But then Charlotte pointed to a black shape. It was circling over the house he was barking at, and it looked huge, even way up there. I couldn't make the details very well. But as I was looking and trying to make out what it was, it started flying toward us. Like it was nosediving towards us, and Baxter started howling. Now he was pulling at the lead and trying to drag us towards it. He wasn't giving up on fighting this thing. I thought for sure we were going to be attacked. The thing was flying fast right at us, and I realized more and more how massive it was. I could now make out for sure that it didn't look like any kind of animal I'd ever seen before. And I also thought I could make out that its eyes were red, and it had this strange pointed head with what looked like a long beak sticking out. Then right as it came to within 20 feet of us, I could feel the wind rushing around us, and Baxter was pulling to get to it, standing on his hind legs. That's when it pulled back up and flew over our heads so closely that we could have jumped and touched it. As it crossed over us, everything went black. That's just the enormity of the thing. It was terrifying. As soon as it passed over us, Charlotte and I made a break for it, screaming at and pulling Baxter. We all ran back to our uncle's house as fast as we could, and I didn't look back that entire run home. Charlotte and I were both really shaken up. Obviously, our parents knew something was wrong, but we just told them that Baxter has almost gotten away from us, and we were just scared from that. Charlotte stopped her evening jogging and didn't want to be outside at night anymore unless we were in a group and in the city, and I couldn't blame her. I, however, was still really curious and wanted to figure out what this thing was. So the following night, at about the same time of day, I took my uncle's binoculars and sat myself in a chair in his yard, facing the direction we had seen it. I sat there for hours. I told my parents I was birdwatching, but really I was curious. I wanted to see that thing again from the safety of the yard. It didn't appear, though, And by that point, our vacation was almost over. Eventually, I had to give up and come back inside. By then, it was too dark anyway. Charlotte still maintains that the creature we saw was some kind of hawk or falcon, but I know that she knows that it was much, much bigger than that. I'm still trying to work out what it was, but it really stinks that I can't talk to her about it. She's basically giving me the silent treatment anytime I try and ask her about it. I work up in North Dakota at a truck dispatcher, working with flock freight and the like. I'm usually working in the office, but I sometimes get called over to our warehouse to do some work with allocating shipping equipment and things like that. I much prefer office work, especially during the winter. If you've never been to North Dakota in January, you sure are lucky because the winters out here are incredibly brutal. This season we had around 50 days that were below zero, and it's very rare that the sun comes out for more than a few hours. If you've ever watched the movie Fargo, you might have an idea of the weather out here. We can get a few feet of snow at a time, and it always sticks because the temperatures never get hot enough to melt it. Then, the entire blanket of snow becomes a thick sheet of ice that's nearly impossible to move. Our guys need to get out there exactly during and after a snowstorm to plow before it starts to freeze. Anyway, on this particular day, wouldn't it be my luck that one of the men who was supposed to plow called off sick? No one else could fill the shift because anyone who was able to plow was already out there plowing. So somehow, I got stuck with the job of shoveling out the driveway of the warehouse. My boss handed me the dinkiest shovel and a company-issued snow jacket and told me to get out there. I'd like to say right here that this was most certainly not in my job description. So during a snowstorm like this, the entire sky basically gets whited out. The clouds become a dark gray that covers up any blue, and the world just looks like it became a few shades dimmer. The wind was biting me, and I kept on having to pull down my hat or readjust my collar or pull up my gloves. After about 10 minutes of shoveling along the edge, I realized that the snow was melting in through my boots. Basically, leaking in through the fabric because I hadn't worn my heavy-duty pair to work, thinking I would just be working in the office. And all I wanted to do at this point was get home. If I wanted to get home, though, I'd have to drive out of the lot, and my car was getting covered and blockaded in by the dumping of snow. So once I cleared a small path out of the warehouse driveway and onto the road, I headed towards the parking lot to deal with my car. Now, I definitely didn't want to deal with anyone else's car, but I got to work dealing with and clearing my car. I started to push a layer off the hood. The snow was really coming down now, and the wind was whipping it all over the place, making it difficult to see what I was doing. When out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure walking towards me. The wind was whipping, and the snow was moving like crazy with it. Sharp spikes of ice crystals were digging into my face, but I couldn't move to pull up my collar because I was concentrating on the figure, trying to focus on it and see who was coming at me. My first thought was that my boss was coming over to ask me to deal with the other cars, or at the very least his car. But what I saw was not a human. Once the figure got closer, I could see that it had dingy white and gray and brown fur. The fur was covered in ice particles, so it almost looked like it was shining and sparkling when they caught the light. My brain was still telling me that it was a coworker in some far-out snowsuit, but when I looked at its face, I realized there was no costume in the world that looked that realistic. This thing had a gray-black nose, almost like an ape, and it peered back at me with dark black eyes. Above its eyes was a thick brow that protruded like a caveman. It had white, furry knuckles, but its fingertip pads and palms were bare and gray. Its legs were like tree trunks, and he moved like a cross between an ape and a human. It started towards me, closer and closer, before I finally unfroze. I clicked into gear and quickly pulled out my key and hopped into my car. Now I hadn't finished clearing my windows, so I couldn't see very clearly where the creature was at first. But then I saw in next to me, and it started circling my car, never getting closer than a foot away. By the way, I promise I'm not making this up. After it circled my car, it moved towards my front window and leaned heavily on the hood. The car started to move downwards in the front under the massive weight of it. So, I decided to lean on the horn, hoping that would go in my favor and not backfire. Luckily, this worked, and the thing was totally spooked. I still couldn't see clearly, but I felt the car lift back up and then nothing. No movement and no noise. I sat there for 5 minutes or so, just hoping and praying that nothing more would happen. I hoped that it had run off the same way it came, back towards the interstate in the woods. When I got out of the car, my hood was dented in the front and there was a stink in the air like garbage. I looked down at the snow and could distinctly make out the tracks in the snow. I started to run back inside to tell my coworkers when a pickup truck started to move into the parking lot. I tried to get him to stop, but I guess he didn't see me, and he went and plowed right through the tracks. I brought out my buddies, and even though they could see the tracks in the snow by the woods, they told me that I was just screwing with them. After that day, I haven't really wanted to tell my story. If you are based in North Dakota, please be aware that there may be this creature lurking nearby, and snowstorms are definitely not a safe time to be outside. Before we get into the stories, I'm excited to announce I have a new channel called Monster Trail Cams. Here's a quick trailer for my new channel. The link is below. Monster Trail Cams is your ticket to the unseen and supernatural. Sourced from a vast network of mystery hunters worldwide, our channel reveals a collection of strange creatures and supernatural events that will leave you on the edge of your seat. From shadowy figures lurking in dense forests to inexplicable entities prowling under the cloak of night, each chilling clip peels back another layer of the world's untold mysteries. We release new episodes several times a week. Okay, now let's get to the stories. I'm a 10-year veteran of the New Jersey Highway Patrol, so forgive me for not attaching my name to this. I'd be laughed right off the force, but I swear to you every word of what I'm about to say is true. A few months ago, I was out on patrol cruising back roads along the Pinelands when I got a call about some frantic teenagers reporting they'd run into the Jersey Devil. My fellow patrolman and I had a good laugh about the call over the radio, but it's obligatory that we take every call seriously, and since I was the closest, I said I'd go check it out. When I got there, I found 4 scared teenagers huddled inside of a Ford Focus with the doors locked. Their front 2 tires were both flat, and they were pulled off to the side of the road with their flashers on. I waved for them to get out of the car and talk to me, but none of them seemed to really be too keen on the idea. Finally, though I managed to coax out the driver, who asked me to shine my spotlight on the car so the others would feel safer coming out too. I did as he asked, and finally I had all 4 kids on their feet and ready to talk to me. The first thing I noticed about the kids was that they all smelled pretty strongly, like they'd been partaking in some extracurricular plant-based activities. Right off, I figured they had got their hands on some stuff that was a little too strong and had embarked on a real bad trip together. It was a good thing the tires on the little Ford were already nearly bald when they came down the gravel and flattened the front ones because they were in no shape to drive. I figured the experience of the bad trip would be punishment enough for smoking, though. After all, I was a kid once myself, and they seemed otherwise pretty harmless. Not to mention they were all about to have to face their parents, too. I had each one of them call home for a ride and promised I'd stay with them until all were picked up. The 2 girls were picked up first and eager to get away. Next was the boy who had ridden passenger. His mom threw an absolute fit and cussed him 2 ways from Tuesday before she ever even got him in the car. It was down to just me and the driver at the end. I made him help me push the car off the side of the road so it wouldn't be hit by anyone throughout the night until he and his dad could come back and haul it home the next morning. At one point, he seemed to realize that I didn't believe what he'd seen. "You know I'd never lie to a cop," he said. I told him I was sure they'd seen something that scared them, but that they needed to lay off the weed because it had clearly made them all paranoid. "It slashed my tires, though," he said. He was almost pleading with me at that point to come take a look. I didn't figure there was any point in arguing with the kid any further. I just told him that I was glad he called and that we were getting everyone home safely. That's about the time his dad pulled up. The first thing the dad wanted to know was if it had been the Jersey Devil that popped the tires. The son said it had, and the dad went off telling us both a wild story about how he'd seen the thing when he was a teenager himself. By then, I figured the kid's paranoia and hallucinations must be related to a genetic thing, or that maybe his parents had done a little too much of the devil's lettuce in their day, too. Dad wound up taking the kid, and I got back in my car to leave. My spotlight was still shining on the back of the car, and before I shut it off, I guess I let curiosity get the better of me. I got out and walked over to the car and shone my flashlight on the tires. I wanted to see if they were really ripped to shreds like the kid kept saying. Oddly enough, they were. There were 3 distinct cuts down the sidewalls of both tires, each spaced about an inch apart. Right then, I heard the most god-awful screech above me and shone my flashlight toward the sky. Whatever was up there had a wingspan at least as wide as the road. I booked it back to my car and headed out of there as quickly as I could. I forgot to even let dispatch know I was leaving until they called me for a status report. When I told them I'd been back on patrol for at least half an hour, they radioed back that they were glad to hear it. They thought the devil might have got me. We all had a good laugh about it, but I never let them know how close that joke came to becoming reality. They wouldn't believe me anyway. The story I'm about to share happened about 10 years ago when I was working for the government. I was younger and idealistic back then, and I thought that my job would be exciting and glamorous. But it turns out that most government work is pretty boring. Don't get me wrong, there are moments of excitement, but those are usually followed by a lot of paperwork. The work I did entailed a lot of travel. I worked for the National Park Service, and I was often sent to different national parks around the country to check in and make sure everything was up to snuff, inspecting protocols and the like. And it was during one of these trips that changed my view of the government forever. I was in Yellowstone National Park doing a routine inspection of the facilities there when I saw something strange. Now, I can't say for sure what it was that I saw, but it definitely wasn't anything that I had ever seen before. It was some kind of living creature, but it was unlike anything in a zoo or anywhere else. So on my first night there, I was driving around in the evening, really getting deep into the park when I stopped my car to take a look around during a particularly beautiful sunset, and that's when I saw it. The creature was walking on 2 legs but did not have fur, which was instantly a strange combination to see. I tried to take a picture of it so I could ask someone more knowledgeable what it was, but it ran off before I could get a clear shot. All I can say is that it looked like some kind of reptile or alien creature. It was definitely not anything that is supposed to exist in our world. I would describe it like this. It was about 7 feet tall, and it had light gray scaly skin, but it also had sort of a greenish tinge to it. It didn't escape me that those are especially good camouflage colors for the park. It had a long tail which was very evident when it took off, and I could see that its eyes glowed yellow when I first caught sight of it. That was the creepiest part. The yellow eyes with those sideways slits. I mean, you know you're not dealing with something nice when you see eyes like that. When it ran off, it moved very fast, and it seemed to be able to disappear into the shadows of the setting sun. The movement of its legs was strange too, and it almost seemed to be hopping, but at the same time it was running. Again, not like anything I've ever seen before. I reported what I had seen to my superiors when I touched base with them the next morning, but they brushed it off quickly and told me not to worry about it. Basically, redirected me back to talking about the job I was there to do. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. I did some more research using my computer accesses into certain databases we have and discovered that there have been numerous reports of strange creatures in national parks all over the country, not just Yellowstone. And I hate to say, but it also looks like the government has been aware of these reports for years, but they have never acknowledged them publicly. I started to piece together the puzzle, and it wasn't long before I came to the conclusion that the government was covering up a program on cryptid creatures in national parks. They were trying to keep the program and the creature's secret from the public, but I had stumbled upon their secret. I decided to approach the workers at Yellowstone that I had become friendly with and ask them if they had seen anything strange. At first, they were hesitant to talk to me, but after I assured them that I wouldn't tell anyone, they started to open up. I learned that there have been sightings of all sorts of creatures in the park, including some that match the description of the one that I saw. Apparently, this has been going on for years, but they have been successful in keeping it a secret. So all of this information only served to fuel my interest in this subject. I decided that before I left Yellowstone, I would take a hike off the beaten path that goes in the direction that I had seen this thing and see if I could find any more evidence of it. I packed my bag with some supplies and headed out. It didn't take long before I found something odd. There was a trail of large footprints that led deep into the woods. I followed the footprints for miles until I came to a clearing, and there, in the middle of the clearing, was a group of these creatures. Well, 3 to be exact. They were eating and playing and completely unaware of my presence. I watched them for a long while until I started to feel nervous and that I needed to get back. I knew that I had seen something incredible, something that the government didn't want anyone to know about. I also knew that I couldn't tell anyone what I had seen. I just knew that would be bad. Plus, I wanted to keep my job, and that meant just keeping my head low. But this story is something that I have to share. The government can try to keep it a secret, but the truth will always find a way to be revealed. I want to tell you about something that happened to me, something that disturbs me even to this day. I don't like to talk a lot about it. I honestly don't even like acknowledging it. When I was younger, I was homeless for a while. I lost my job and things spiraled out of control for me. I'm proud to say that things have turned around since. Now I have a beautiful family, a good job, an apartment, and a car, and I'm able to put food on the table every night in these crazy times. But that wasn't the case for me about 7 years ago, and this is when I experienced something worse than I ever could have imagined. I was living on the streets of New York City. I had to get creative to find a decent meal and a place to sleep that was somewhat safe. One night I even woke up to rats crawling all over me. As messed up as it was, I was able to find some sense of normalcy through it all. I lived on a bench near a bakery, and the owner would give me some food that he would have to throw away otherwise. He would donate what I didn't eat to the homeless shelter and was all around a nice guy. One night I was trying to sleep on the bench, and this delightful old lady gave me the coziest blanket that she had made. It still warms my heart today to think about her kind gesture during the worst time of my life. I was all bundled up and had fallen asleep when I awoke to someone shoving my back. I flipped over to see who it was, but there was nobody there. It was common for me to not get the greatest sleep on that bench, so I figured it was just my mind, and I tried to get back to sleep. About a minute later, someone shoved my back again, and I immediately turned to see what it was. There was nobody around. I just sat there for a while, waiting to see if the person would return. There would be the occasional passerby, but nobody who seemed to be paying me any mind. I decided to try to fall back asleep, but this time I faced the street so I would see whoever was doing this. After a while, I was able to go back to sleep, but this time I was shoved right in the stomach. I opened my eyes, and inches from me was a faceless man. I sat up and tried to figure out who it was, thinking I wasn't seeing correctly, but my mind was not playing tricks on me. Standing in front of the bench was a tall, skinny man in a suit with no face. I shot up and looked around to see what was happening. Peeking around the corner from the bakery was another faceless man. I looked to my left, and standing 20 feet away was another one. I screamed at them to go away, but the two further away started coming toward me. I got up off the bench and took off down the street. I ran until I couldn't breathe, and I went into an alley to hide. I didn't see them after that, so eventually I settled down and decided to sleep in that alley for the night. Luckily, the rest of the night was uneventful, other than me not sleeping a wink. I thought the dangerous criminals and lunatics in the streets were scary, But from that night, I learned there are much more terrifying things out there, things that we can't defend ourselves against. I stopped sleeping on that bench and avoided that bakery altogether. I still think about that nice shop owner sometimes, but I will never set foot anywhere near that place again. So that event has never left my mind. And once I got back on my feet, I really started thinking about it again, trying to piece it together in hopes that I hadn't gone completely mad that night. I tried to research what those things could have possibly been, but when you search faceless men on Google, all that comes up are results from that damn Game of Thrones show. Is it possible that the show exists just to cover the identity of the faceless men? It's a very popular show after all. I've never seen it, but it creeps me out that I can't find any other results for faceless men. I can't be the only person to have encountered these faceless men. I got to thinking that it could have been kids playing a prank on me, but those figures weren't wearing masks. I could see the sweat on their skin. They were also incredibly fast. When they shoved me, I turned around in seconds and they weren't there. They were also too skinny and tall to be human beings. I'll probably be on a list somewhere now, but I don't care. These monsters need to be exposed. If anybody else out there has had an experience with faceless men, please let me know. Even if you haven't, but you have information or an opinion on what these things could have been, please share that. It was scary enough as a single man, but it's much scarier now that I have my wife and kid. It creeps me out that they have to live in a world where they could encounter one of these things. I am also grateful to God that I haven't seen any since that night. I hope and pray that I never cross paths with those things ever again. I've been noticing some strange occurrences in Newark, New Jersey. I don't exactly know what's going on, but I figured you and your viewers may be interested. I like to explore abandoned buildings and historic sites. Sometimes I post the videos online. I often visit abandoned malls, hospitals, asylums, and even zoos. I've run into my fair share of trouble while visiting these places, but nothing quite like this. One of the most creepy places in the whole world happens to be right in my hometown, Old Essex County Jail. It is an abandoned jail that has deteriorated beyond recognition. There are walls falling down and holes in the ceiling. The entire building complex has been left in ruins since the 1970s. The place is covered in overgrown weeds and vines. The cells and fences are rusting and crumbling down. Many squatters and homeless individuals have moved in throughout the years, but they usually end up leaving pretty quickly. There has always been something odd about that place. In most abandoned buildings, lots of teens will like to break in to vandalize the place, but even the toughest teenagers won't go to spray paint in there. There just have been too many stories about odd things happening in there. Well, I figured this week was a great time for me to start documenting my explorations in there, so I strapped on my GoPro and headed over last weekend. I wanted to spend a full night in the jail. I know this sounds odd, but there is a lot to be discovered, and I wanted to get a full picture of the place. I like to explore on my own because when I go with other people, it can be very distracting. So I drove over and parked in a parking lot in the southeast corner of the complex. Although there are no trespassing signs all over the place, it is quite easy to enter pretty much any of the buildings. The locks on nearly all of the gates have been cut and there are gaps in the fences. The field along the perimeter is plain and isn't in too bad of shape, just a large grassy area with overgrown weeds. The path to the main buildings is a dirt road. It didn't look like anyone had been over there in a while. I walked down the road, taking in the sights as I could. It wasn't so bad out there. I even saw some birds building a nest and deer munching on the grass. I took my time walking into the buildings because I wanted some good shots of the exterior. Once inside, I ventured all over the jailhouse, from the intake room to the cafeteria to the cells, and then down to the rec rooms. There was a ton to see, and I understood why so many people were creeped out by the place. It was absolutely disgusting. There were broken bottles strewn across the floor. The bars on the cells were cracking. The exposed pipes had massive holes in them. The tiles on the floor were peeling, and there was a putrid odor all throughout the place. The most strange area of the building was the courtyard. The building walls surrounded this section on all four sides, and there was a huge oak tree growing right in the center of a grassy field. There was a cracked basketball court and small section that could have been for lifting weights. Hanging from the oak tree was a large, maybe 6-foot blob of... I don't know what. It almost looked like a giant cocoon, as it was made up of layers of a thin, papery material. There was a large hole in the bottom, and a dark black goo was dripping out of the thing. I thought maybe it was a nest of some kind, but I realized now I was completely wrong. I really didn't want to spend the night, but I knew my viewers would be disappointed if I didn't. So I set up my tent in the lookout tower, which was the most comfortable area I could find. It was convenient because I could see my car in case there was a problem, and I had a bird's eye view of the entire facility. Once it got dark around 8:30, I tried to get some shut-eye. I left on my lantern as a sort of nightlight and got as cozy as I could in my sleeping bag. At around midnight, I was woken up by a loud banging noise. I knew it couldn't have been the wind, it was far too loud. I grabbed my lantern and adjusted the knob to make it brighter. Now I had a clear look at the cause of the racket. A huge figure with giant wings flung itself against the window of the lookout tower. The entire room shook, and I heard the glass begin to crack. Again, it hurled itself at the window. The thing was terrifying. It had large red eyes that glowed in the light of my lantern. Its body was a stark black and covered in fuzz and feathers. I was in shock and didn't know what to do. I started to run down the stairs of the lookout tower to get away, but I fell as I began to stand up. My lantern crashed down and broke. In that instant, I was in complete darkness. The banging stopped. I heard the thing take flight on its powerful wings, and soon it was gone. I believe that the creature I encountered was part moth, part bat, and maybe part human. After that night, I did a great deal of research on this creature, and I know that it must have been attracted to the light from my lantern. I may only be alive to tell this tale because it happened to break during my fall. I understand now that this creature must be the reason why no one dares to enter this complex, and I don't think I ever will again. I never thought I'd be one of the people that had a close encounter, but here I am, joining the ranks of the believers. Once you've seen something with your own eyes, it doesn't matter anymore what other people say. I live in Watkins Glen in upstate New York, at the base of Seneca Lake. We have a lot of wilderness areas around here, and we see our share of black bears and deer, and even the occasional moose. I've lived here my whole life. This all started with my daughter, Amy, who's 7. She's our only child, and she spends more time than she should indoors. When I was a kid, I remember my mom had a hard time getting me in through the door for supper. But I guess kids these days are different. Even though I restrict her screen time, she spends a lot of her afternoons just drawing pictures and coloring. I guess that's not so bad, but I think all children need to be outside, enjoying the fresh air, for at least a couple of hours a day. There aren't any kids her age near our house, so that's part of the problem. Our closest neighbor is a half-mile away. I remember it was a Wednesday afternoon when it all started. We like to have chicken on Wednesdays, so I was mixing up a marinade for the chicken when Amy came into the kitchen. She wanted a snack. It was a couple hours till dinner, so I gave her an apple. She whined a little. She'd wanted chips, but like I told her, you don't always get what you want. Amy had been coloring in the living room, but now she was getting bored and right on the verge of cranky. I told her to put on her sneakers and go outside to play for a while. Fresh air is the best cure for a youngster's crankiness, in my opinion. I watched her for a minute through the kitchen window. Our backyard ends at a deep stretch of woods, but Amy knows not to go in them. So far, she'd always followed the rules. Plus, what kid isn't afraid to be alone in the woods? I saw she'd taken her apple with her, and I almost went to the door to remind her to eat it all and not just throw it on the ground. She saw that once when I tried to see how far I could throw one, and you know how kids are, copying everything you do. I got busy preparing dinner then, and didn't watch her too much. About 15 minutes later, Amy was back inside, heading for the fridge. I said, "Hey now, what are you after?" And she told me she needed another apple. "What happened to the first one? Did you drop it?" I asked her. She said no. She gave it to the hairy man. I about dropped the potato I was peeling. "What hairy man?" I was over to the window in a flash, but there wasn't anybody in the yard. Amy told me the hairy man didn't have a name, and that's when I figured she'd imagined it. Probably she dropped the apple and didn't want to say. I know some people will think I should have been more worried, but we aren't near the city or any neighbors, and Amy is given to imaginary friends. I just let it go. Told her no more snacks, go wash your hands for dinner. She did, and then came back to color some more. It wasn't until after she was in bed that night, and I was cleaning up her crayons and papers, that I saw it. A drawing she'd made? I recognized the stick figure, in a red shirt and blue shorts with braids, as Amy, but the figure she'd drawn standing next to her was kind of a shock. It towered over her, all scribbled in brown crayon. It looked like an ape with a person's face. That kid's sure got imagination. I put it out of my mind until the next day when Amy went missing. She'd been right there in the backyard, and I could see her through the window. The next minute she was gone. I ran outside calling her name, but she didn't answer, and I really started to get scared. I went into the woods behind the house and walked around calling her and getting more panicked by the second. And then I heard her voice. I followed the sound, and all of a sudden I spotted her standing in a clearing. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was this giant creature about 6.5 feet tall, standing only 10 feet away from my little girl. It had animal fur all over it and a bumpy face like a caveman. Its arms were really long, its hands hung almost down to its knees, and its back seemed hunched. It stood on 2 legs but not up straight, if you know what I mean. I swear it looked exactly like how people describe a Bigfoot monster. I screamed and ran forward. My baby was in danger. The thing turned and looked at me and made this sound like a loud grunt, deep, but not really a growl, and then it just crashed through the woods away from Amy. Poor Amy was so panicked she fell on the ground and started to shake and cry. I ran over and scooped her up and ran back inside, checking her all over. No injuries. But I called the police and then my husband right away. I was totally hysterical. Unfortunately, that's how they treated me, like a hysterical person. They didn't believe it was Bigfoot, of course. I mean, I could hardly believe it, and I saw it. They checked the woods and saw no sign of anyone. They asked Amy questions, but didn't believe her either when she told them about the hairy man who liked apples. I was pretty worried, thinking Amy almost got kidnapped. We went out and bought a dog the next day to keep us alerted and safe. A German Shepherd. I know what I saw. It wasn't human. Even with a dog, I'm afraid to let Amy go outside now, but she's pretty content to just stay in and draw pictures. Lots of pictures of the hairy man. So that's my experience. I'm now a believer. So, I recently moved back to Philly for a job. I'm a few blocks down from my parents' place. My mom and dad are getting up there in years, so I've been spending a lot of time helping them fix some things in their house. Now, a problem my parents have had for as long as I can remember is getting the trash truck to come. Half the houses on their block have been either abandoned or condemned by the city, and the sanitation department will sometimes take their house off the trash route by accident. It's a headache, and it means trash can pile up on our sidewalk for weeks sometimes. So what happened was, about 2 months ago, garbage started piling up again. And to make matters worse, we were throwing out more junk than usual because of the repairs, so our sidewalk was cluttered and our bins were full. One morning my dad gets up and sees that one of the trash bins was destroyed. My parents used those heavy-duty bins with the animal locks to keep the raccoons out. But this bin had its lid completely ripped off, and everything inside had spilled onto the street. My dad was so upset. That particular can had been used for our kitchen garbage, so it had old leftovers and food scraps. We figured maybe an animal smelled it and it was too good to pass up. I was annoyed, but I didn't think too much of it. None of us did. It was just a trash can, so it wasn't that big a deal. But then our trash bins kept getting broken into, even when they were pulled off the street and it wasn't trash day. And some of them had dents like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them. Of course, any bags we left out for pickup on pickup day were ripped open. Our streets smelled and looked disgusting on those days. When the trash guys came, it was so bad they couldn't even collect anything. Those guys weren't picking stuff up off the street. This went on for roughly a few weeks, and my mom had had enough. She was completely fed up. She kept asking the neighbors if they had seen anything or anyone out there, and they all said no. At that point, she thought maybe someone had it out for us and was trying to send a message. She called the sanitation department to ask for extra pickups, and they said no, their trucks weren't available to do that. So it looked like no one was going to help us fix this. So I decided to go to the store and get one of those motion sensor floodlights. I got it. I set it up, and I put it on the house above the sidewalk in front of the house. It was pointed at the trash cans. So my dad and I decided to stay up on a Friday night and see if we could catch the culprit. And around midnight, we heard the first noise. We heard a crash, and we both saw the floodlight turn on, and we could see that the noise was coming from one of the trash cans. Something huge and furry was tearing into it. I hoped the spotlight would scare it away, but it didn't budge. It was too dark to see anything else except the animal's silhouette, but I knew that it had to be bigger than I was. Everything about it just seemed big and muscular. It looked like it could tear apart anything it wanted to. I didn't want to go out there, and neither did my dad. But we had to do something. My dad grabbed a block of wood that was still inside from the repairs, opened the door, and chucked it at the animal as hard as he could. It barely moved when it got hit, but it did look up. And I'm telling you, it had the face of a dog. One of those skinny, mean ones, too. Its eyes even reflected the light like a dog's. My dad picked up another block and threw it, and this time the animal ran off down the street. We closed the door and waited. When we were absolutely sure that it wasn't coming back, we went outside to inspect the damage. Everything smelled like urine and sulfur. And now that we knew what we were up against, things started to make sense. It liked our kitchen trash the best. Even though it obviously wasn't one, it seemed to eat like a raccoon. It was a scavenger. The next day, I picked up some rat poison. Before, we'd been hesitant to use it because we didn't want to accidentally kill someone's pet, but now we just wanted to drive the creature away without getting hurt ourselves. Over the next 2 days, I mixed the poison in with our garbage, and I made sure to sleep over at my parents' house just in case. We set the trash out for the night, turned the floodlights on, and hoped for the best. Everything was a mess in the morning, just like we expected. We figured we wouldn't be able to tell if our plan worked for at least a few days. So when I set our garbage out again a few days after that, I worried that I'd find the same thing as before. But nothing was touched. Our bins were fine, and this time all was exactly where I'd left them. And it's been like that ever since. Hopefully this creature has moved on. Either way, he's gone from our house. I grew up on a farm in the northeastern part of the U.S. in Vermont. Our closest neighbor was 3 miles away, so it was really isolated. Farm work is hard work, which I knew from watching my parents, but there were so many benefits to growing up in such a rural area. One of my favorite things was when my older sister and I would take a blanket outside at night to look for shooting stars. We'd bring snacks and just lie there quietly, each of us getting 1 point for every shooting star we saw. She was 5 years older than me, so I was never as good as her at spotting them. She would try to point them out, but they often disappeared before I could find them. On one completely ordinary night, my sister pointed to the east and said, "There's one." I saw it immediately. And as it arced across the sky, I couldn't believe how long we were able to track it. Then out of nowhere, 3 other shooting stars zoomed toward it, but seemed to stop in midair. Then all 4 of the lights changed direction simultaneously and started moving in formation toward the south. My sister and I watched this play out wide-eyed. We watched the lights move across the sky, and we craned our necks to follow their path. Once they disappeared, we looked at each other. A second or so passed, and then Laura said, "I think we just saw UFOs." I was only 8, so I was pretty freaked out. I didn't say a word as we gathered up our things and headed through the dark back toward our house. We didn't tell our parents or our brother what we saw because we were both struggling, hoping to figure out some other explanation that wasn't so freaky for the strange lights. The next day, the whole family piled into our truck for a shopping trip to town. Turns out that, to my surprise, people at the grocery store were talking about the weird lights. When someone asked my mother if she happened to see them, she said no, but mentioned that Laura and I had been stargazing the night before. She then turned to us and asked us if we had seen any lights in the sky, and without any hesitation, both of us said no. We didn't want to answer any questions about what we had seen. It was the right decision. There were a few articles in the newspaper about the lights, and some of the people who claimed the lights were UFOs were mocked by the community. The morning DJs at the local radio station even made a song about the Nutsos that thought they had seen UFOs instead of realizing they were military planes on maneuvers, which was the official story. It's now been many years since we saw the lights. But Laura actually brought that night up a few years ago after both of us had had a few drinks. She told me that in the years that followed, she had convinced herself that what we had seen were jets flying the sky. She no longer thought it was UFOs like she told me all those years ago. I argued with her a bit over it, saying how could she do that to me because I still believed what she told me. Eventually, we agreed to disagree. But to be honest, I think that even though she thinks she has talked herself out of the truth, both of us know that those lights were definitely not of this world. Before we get into the stories, I'm excited to announce I have a new channel called Monster Trail Cams. Here's a quick trailer for my new channel. The link is below. Monster Trail Cams is your ticket to the unseen and supernatural. Sourced from a vast network of mystery hunters worldwide, our channel reveals a collection of strange creatures and supernatural events that will leave you on the edge of your seat. From shadowy figures lurking in dense forests to inexplicable entities prowling under the cloak of night, each chilling clip peels back another layer of the world's untold mysteries. We release new episodes several times a week. Okay, now let's get to the stories. My family and I had the craziest experience in Yellowstone in 2015. In my opinion, Yellowstone National Park is probably one of the most haunted places in America, and yet it still attracts over 4 million visitors every year. The park's history is filled with missing persons, deaths, and strange events. It has even gained the title in some circles as being the Bermuda Triangle of the United States. Some investigations show that there are actually more than 120 people who have gone missing in Yellowstone without a trace, but the official numbers are nowhere near that number. It is said that Yellowstone's history is filled with restless spirits, strange creatures, and other paranormal activities. Some visitors have even captured mysterious images, which park officials and researchers have been unable to explain. These images include creatures that can't be identified, ghostly visions that appear to walk through fire, and flying creatures. Yellowstone has even made worldwide news because of these strange incidents. But anyway, I'm here to tell you what happened to me on my visit to Yellowstone in 2015. It all started early afternoon on a Friday. I was there with my wife and kids enjoying the park. We lived just outside the park and had entered from the north entrance. We were planning to not go too far in and just make a day of it. After we hiked for an hour or so, we decided to stop at a relatively open area along the trail to take a break. My wife and I sat down, but the kids still had energy and continued running around. They were climbing up all over rocks and chasing each other through the trees. We couldn't have asked for a better day until they found the backpack. We hadn't been sitting there long before our youngest, who was 14 at the time, started yelling for me to come and see what he found. He said, "Dad, come here and see this." There's this backpack just hanging from the tree. I told my wife to keep an eye on our other son as I walked over to where he was. When I got there, he pointed up into the tree that had large branches coming off of it at various angles and heights above the ground. I looked up to see an old backpack that was tied around one of the branches 20 or 30 feet above us. I immediately started looking around at the ground to see if there were any other signs that anyone had been in this spot recently, but it didn't look like anything else was out of place. My son wanted me to climb up and get it, so I hoisted myself up until I was sitting on another branch about 8 feet off the ground, and from there I could actually use the limbs to climb, and I eventually got myself close enough to the bag to touch it with my hand. I leaned in to untie it from the branch, and as soon as I touched the bag, it basically disintegrated, broke loose, and fell to the ground next to my son. I climbed back down to the ground and looked at my son. We didn't even have to unzip it as it basically turned to dust when it fell. Inside the main compartment, we found a water bottle, some matches, and an old pocket knife. But then I reached for the inner pocket and found an old, worn driver's license. It was dated 2006 and belonged to a blonde girl whose name was Susan, but I couldn't make out her last name due to the card being so tattered from the elements. And then the air pressure seemed to change right at that moment, and that is when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was a creature, but just for a split second. It was big and black and moving quickly into the trees. But it wasn't on 4 legs. It walked on only 2, and it paused for a brief second, and then continued on. I immediately decided that we needed to contact park officials about everything that was happening around us, especially to see if they had any information on girls missing from that time period or who otherwise matched the description of the girl on the license. Luckily, we had cell service, and so we called right then. Whoever answered the phone told me that 2 young women had gone missing not far from where we were hiking. It was in the spring of 2009. She said she remembers the story well and was still at her same job back then. And even though she had been instructed to never talk about it, the story had always haunted her as she prayed for closure for the families. She said that apparently the girls had been with a larger group, and that others in the group claimed that the 2 girls trailed behind them a bit, but after some time, they looked back to check on them, but they were gone. Authorities launched a full-scale search for these 2 young ladies, but no trace of them or their belongings have ever been found. Well, possibly until now. The woman on the phone went on to say that there was also something unusual about this story. She had heard that one of the girls' mothers claimed she received a phone call from her daughter after the girls got lost. Her daughter said that a creature had been following them, and they kept seeing it, but it would dart behind trees. They couldn't shake the thing, and they also couldn't catch up to their friends, and with all the running they did, they were now lost. They described it as huge and furry with a crazy look to it, but that it walked in a way that reminded them of a man. So at this point, the girls were terrified, but were going to continue walking until they ran into something or someone who could help them get away from this creature. And that's when the call dropped, and the mom never heard from her daughter again. I asked if this creature might have been a bear, but the woman said no because they specifically described it as being bigger than any bear, not only taller, but much larger overall. And that's when she told me to not even bother trying to report this any further and that I should just drop it. She said she had personally read through the report, and there is no mention of a creature in it. It's just a regular missing persons case. And now I don't know how to move forward with this. I'm concerned for these girls. But on the other hand, if there really is a creature out there, well, I can't imagine what kind of creature it might be. Do you think it might be possible that these girls got mixed up with some creature or creatures that weren't supposed to exist in the first place, and now they're loose and have been attacking people who happen to wander into their path? I don't know. I just want to know what happened to them, and if they're still out there somewhere in this creature's grasp. I realize that those chances are nearly impossible. But no trace of them at all? And if it's too late for that, then I want closure. Somehow this has become really personal for me, and my imagination can't stop working overtime on this whole situation. And I don't want to drop it. I'm not dropping it. I need all the help I can get with something like this. It's too big for me now, and I need closure, not only because of the missing girls, but also because of what I saw myself, darting through the trees. I can't get it out of my head. So anyway, I've been doing my own research ever since, and I am pretty sure that this creature is really out there. I feel that it hides behind the trees on the ridgeline of the mountain. It is dark gray with black fur on the back of the neck, almost like a mane. And I swear its head is shaped like a human skull with larger canine teeth jutting out from its jaw. And one more thing. I do think it's very probable that this creature is responsible for the disappearance of those 2 girls, and possibly others who have gone missing. Growing up, I always wanted to be a nurse. So right out of high school, I attended Loyola University in New Orleans to pursue my nursing degree. After graduation, I applied to every opening I could find in the area. I was only 22 and felt like I could save the world. The first interview I got was at a nursing home. I sort of had the idea that nursing homes were sad places. I was very close with my grandparents, and it was hard to imagine what it would be like for them to leave their home to live in a facility. I thought of all the comfort and cheer I would be able to bring to the place. So, without much further thought, I took the job and was excited to start working. I was stationed on the 3rd floor. And I know that this might sound depressing, but the 3rd floor was the floor for residents who weren't expected to last much longer. Most of them had an Alzheimer's diagnosis. There were such a variety of people there. Some were sweet and quiet. Some were sad. Some seemed to be stuck in the past and didn't know where they were. One guy, George, was really belligerent. Whenever it was time for his personal care, we needed 2 or 3 people to be in the room to manage him. He really didn't realize we were there to help him, and he'd swing his arms out and try to strike out at us. One time he really clocked me good in the shoulder and sent me stumbling across the room. I loved talking to the residents who were coherent. Even if they didn't totally understand where they were able to share some amazing stories. It also seemed that they really enjoyed telling them. There was one lady who I was really curious about. Her name was Evelyn. She seemed to be really attached to her faith, and whenever we would serve meals, she would stand up and start praying. It was hard to get her to settle down and eat. I think she thought the other residents were part of her congregation or something, since they were all assembled in the dining room. I'm not sure what religion she was following, but she was very devoted. I tried to converse with her, but she would always respond with something pretty hard to understand. There were special instructions in her chart on how to handle her in the event of her death. She had a DNR order, which means do not resuscitate. We weren't allowed to do CPR or anything if something happened to her. She was to be allowed to die a natural death. That wasn't unusual. A lot of people on the 3rd floor had DNRs. But we also were not allowed to touch her after death to do any post-mortem care. We also knew that in the event of her death, we were to contact the family and they would come and prepare the body on their own. Apparently, they had their own special way of doing things. But she actually seemed to be one of the most fit residents we had. I didn't anticipate her dying anytime soon. She actually seemed to get more energetic, especially at mealtimes, and recently it seemed that her praying was getting louder and louder. Now, this would have been fine, but she started agitating the other residents. Many of them were nonverbal, but they would start to moan or rock back and forth and look anxious and upset. They didn't understand what was going on with her loud voice. Sometimes George especially would get worked up and start swinging at people, and then we couldn't get near him to feed him. So sometimes we had to have Evelyn eat in her room. She hated the overhead fluorescent lights, so her room was lit with a few battery-powered globes. They were round and glowing but didn't give much light. There was an ornate mirror on her dresser. It looked like a very old antique. The problem with having her eat in a room was that she insisted on standing in front of the mirror for her praying at mealtime. But somehow our staff managed to keep everyone semi-happy and fairly well fed, in spite of all the different needs we had to deal with. One evening I sent a CNA, a nursing assistant, to bring Evelyn out for dinner. But it wasn't long before the CNA rushed back to the station and said Evelyn was lying in her bed and appeared to have died. I managed to catch the medical director before she left for the day, and she came and confirmed the death. So I called the family right away to let them know. The family arrived within the hour. They gathered around the bed and washed the body with special products they had brought. Then they began to wrap the body in a shroud made of silk while they prayed. I was trying to be inconspicuous, but also available if they needed anything. The way her mirror was angled, I could see what they were doing from the doorway by the reflection. Their praying got louder, and suddenly there was a huge release of breath from the body. And then, in the mirror, I watched as the image of Evelyn floated up in the corner of the room, up to the ceiling level. But when I shifted my eyes to look directly there, I couldn't see her. I could only see her reflection in the mirror. She was just faintly visible, but it was definitely her. I looked back and forth and could see her in the mirror every time. I could see her looking down, watching everything. When that gasp of breath happened, one of the family members opened the window, and then they all started waving silk scarves around the room. And Evelyn, or whatever you call it, her spirit or whatever, drifted out through the window. I honestly don't think her family could see her. They weren't watching the mirror. And in fact, most of their eyes were closed. At that point, I was just gobsmacked. Needless to say, I wasn't expecting to see something like that at all. After the family left, I went and sat at the nurse's station. My mind was racing, and I tried to talk myself into thinking I had imagined the whole thing. But in the end, I knew what I saw. And let's just say I now have a whole new view on life and death and dying. I'm a teacher in western Pennsylvania, a few hours north of Pittsburgh in Clarion County. I've been seeing some strange things lately, and I'd really love to share my story, because I'm stumped for an explanation right now. Like I said, I live in western PA with my family. We're technically in a suburb, but our area is pretty woodsy, and once you cross the highway, you're basically cut off from civilization. Our high school, middle school, and grade school are all on the same plot of land. I'm the science teacher for the high school, and my daughter's in 5th grade. Sometimes she'll come and hang out in my office during lunch. So these incidents started back in February. My daughter said some of her classmates saw an animal in the woods around the school. Of course, the playground area is fenced in, and so I wasn't super concerned. They thought it was a giant lizard, and all the kids agreed it had to be as big as a car. Now, as a teacher, I'm supposed to report any credible animal sightings to the administration offices because you never know what's out there. We have dealt with a black bear that got too close a few years ago, some unruly deer and things like that. And I know that my daughter knows that these allegations will be taken seriously. She's not the kind of kid that makes stuff up. So I believe her when she says they all saw a reptile of some kind. I just think the kids are exaggerating how big it was. I didn't make a formal report right away, but rather started with just giving the other teachers a heads up in case any rumors start getting around. I'm thinking the kids will talk about it for a day or two and it'll pass. But a few days later, some of the high school teachers say they've gotten reports from their high school students. Apparently, some kids were at school after dark for rehearsals, and they saw something wandering around the edge of campus. It walked on 2 legs, so they thought it might be someone that got lost out there. But when they started to walk over to the edge of the fence, one of them saw that it had claws and scales. Some of the students were claiming it was either a hoax, or some even were saying that someone's pet Komodo dragon escaped, which of course isn't possible, but I think they were trying to rationalize the thing they saw any way they could. And of course, the teachers are thinking it's just some of the high school kids playing a prank, right? But I don't know, something about it just set me on edge. It felt weird that my daughter's friends had just seen this thing too. And I really didn't think anyone was running around pretending to be a giant lizard. It was so unbelievable it seemed too stupid to be a prank, if that makes sense. Then a week or so later, I had to drive in early on Monday because I was on bus duty. It was about 7 in the morning, and the road up to the school was mostly empty. I had my headlights on because it was pretty foggy out too. And as I got closer to the school, I started to see movement in the trees on the side of the road. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or something, but I could have sworn it was gray. It was moving pretty fast. I looked away for a second and looked back, and it was gone. I didn't see it cross the road, so I thought it must have gone back into the woods. I slowed down just in case because I didn't want to hit it. I looked over to the side of the road again, and when I looked forward, a deer ran out in front of me. I slammed the brakes too hard and swerved towards the forest. And while I was swerving, I caught that thing in my headlights. When my headlights hit it, it stood up like a human, but its eyes were yellow, and it had this huge, scaly head. It hissed at me, and I saw its huge teeth. It then ran away when it saw my car aiming for it. This all happened in a split second and left me very shook up. I didn't hit that creature, but I wish I had. When I saw it, I was glad I hadn't brought my daughter with me that day because I didn't want her to freak out any more than I was. I pulled back onto the road and headed for the school. I was really confused by what I saw, but I knew that my mind hadn't created seeing that. But I also knew that there wasn't a way I could make a report without people thinking I was crazy. The best I could do was tell my daughter not to ever go into the woods around the school. And like I said before, she's a good kid, so she listened to me. I hoped that would be the end of it, but then a few weeks later our cafeteria got broken into. Since our school is so small, all the grades use the same cafeteria. There's enough food in there for a couple hundred people. But someone had broken in and gotten into the fridge. They left a huge mess behind, including food strewn everywhere and liquids spilled everywhere. It was disgusting. I volunteered to help with the cleanup. By the time this happened, talk of the creature had all but completely dissipated, and we figured it was just vandalism, but then the same vandalism started happening in town too. The grocery stores and the delis were broken into. It was the strangest thing. We had to call a town hall meeting about it because everyone was suspicious of everyone else, thinking someone must know something. But honestly, I got to thinking that it was that lizard creature I saw. Because the kids were right, it was huge. I didn't know whether to speak up or not. It didn't seem like anyone else saw it around anymore, not even the students. I wondered if it had become fully nocturnal after the previous incidents. Or maybe it was smart enough to hide, which in and of itself was super scary. Things got really bad for a while. We have a lot of hunters in our town, and one of our neighbors lost a season's worth of venison from a freezer in their shed. I personally think the lizard thing is a scavenger, and once it picked our town clean, it moved on. Because one day the break-ins just stopped completely. Maybe it's moved on and is harassing people somewhere else now. But I haven't heard any news of anything, so who knows? Like I said before, I wish I would have hit it with my car. I worked as a ranger for the National Park Service for many years, and in that time I saw some pretty strange things. But nothing could prepare me for what I witnessed one day in Grand Teton National Park. I was out on patrol, making my rounds through the park. It was late in September and the leaves were just starting to change color. The air was crisp and the sky was clear. I remember thinking it was going to be a beautiful day. I was driving along the road, keeping an eye out for wildlife and any visitors in need of assistance. As I rounded a bend, I saw something moving in the bushes off to the side of the road. Or more accurately, I should say that I saw the bushes shaking in an unusual way and that none of the other buses around were moving. So I rolled my vehicle to a stop closer to the bush but remained inside. I wanted to be safe and not sorry in case I was about to encounter a sick or wounded animal. Animals that are scared or in shock can be very dangerous. What I observed next completely shocked me. It wasn't long before out from the undergrowth came a large furry creature. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But there, in front of me, was a creature I had never seen before. It was large with a long snout. It almost looked like a cross between a bear and a wolf and a rat, if you can picture those three things together. But more the size of a bear. The creature was staring at me. I think the sound of my vehicle had brought it out. And for a moment we just locked eyes, and it cocked its head a bit and squinted. It was like it was almost trying to communicate with me. Luckily, it didn't look wounded, so I felt better about that. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared out from the brush, the creature ran off and was gone. I sat in my car for a few moments, trying to process what I had just seen. I knew there were no animals like that in Grand Teton National Park. But what could it have been? Was I seeing things? I then decided to get out of my vehicle and check the bushes that it had been in. Maybe there was something there that could help me understand what I had just seen. I walked over to the exact spot and looked down. There in the grass were large footprints. Wide footprints with 5 toes and about a 10-inch width. This was definitely not something I had ever seen before, and it honestly left me with more questions than answers. I radioed into headquarters and told them about the incident and what I was finding. My boss, who I really like a lot, told me to come back to the station and fill out a report. But to be honest, I don't think he really processed what I had said because he didn't react with any surprise. He almost sounded distracted and just answering me without thinking. When I got back to the station, I sat down and wrote out a report of what I had seen. But even as I did, I still couldn't quite believe it myself. I submitted the report and went home that evening. But the image of that creature stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my mind. I did some research and found out that there have been other sightings of similar creatures in national parks across the country. They are commonly referred to as cryptids. There is no scientific evidence of their existence, but there are enough reports from reliable witnesses to make me believe that they are real. I never saw the creature again, but I often think about it and wonder where it came from and what its life is like. Maybe one day we will have the answers to those questions. I want to tell you guys about something weird that happened to me last weekend. We live in Tellico Plains, Tennessee, and we went out to the Dollar General on a Sunday afternoon to buy some stuff for the week. On our way home, we were driving along one of the back roads and the car started to sputter. It's a real clunker, but we just can't afford to buy a new one. We were just praying it would go a little further because that stretch of road is pretty remote. And I really didn't want to have to walk 2 miles in sandals with wedge heels. But no, luck wasn't with us, and the damn thing coasted to a stop. Thankfully, my boyfriend Frank managed to steer it off to the side as it died. So at least it wasn't in the middle of the road. It was Sunday evening by then, so there wasn't much chance of us getting a tow, unless we went with one of those 24-hour services and they charge an arm and a leg. As far as small local garages go, you got Tellico Auto and Sheps, and they're both closed on Sundays. It's a pretty small town. I know some of you are going to say we should have AAA. Yeah, that would be nice, but these days we can barely afford to pay our rent. Anyway, it sucked, but sometimes you got to just deal with it. I knew Frank didn't want to call anyone we knew for help, since it seemed like lately we're always asking for favors. The pandemic really screwed us up, and now all we can find is part-time work. So we started walking. Frank seemed pretty hopeful a car would come along sooner or later, and we wouldn't have to walk the whole way. He might have been just trying to make me feel better. We were walking on the side of the road, and there's an area of deep woods before it opens up to a field. As we were hoofing it along next to the woods, I started getting this creepy feeling that something was in there, watching us. I kept looking off to the side, and Frank noticed and asked me what was wrong. I felt kind of silly, but I told him, and he laughed and said not to worry. It's not like there's anything big enough to hurt us where we live. He's right as far as animals go. Foxes, raccoons, possums, and deer don't exactly pose a threat. But I was kind of spooking myself, thinking it might be a person. Which is totally not logical, because we're out in the middle of nowhere, right? Well, I was right, and there was something there. We both heard a noise behind us and we turned around to look. There was something standing in the middle of the road. I was like, is that a person? Because it was tall enough to be one. We couldn't see it that well, but it didn't look right to be a human form. It was up on 2 legs, but the upper body seemed triangular. Frank said, I don't know what the hell that is. Let's go. He started hurrying, which made me really nervous because he's never scared. So I'm trying to walk faster and my feet are really killing me. I keep looking behind us, and even though I never saw it move, somehow this thing seemed closer every time I looked. I was really starting to freak out. Frank must have noticed it was getting closer too, because all of a sudden he stopped and turned around, yelling, "Hey!" really loud, like he was trying to scare it off. I turned around too to see, and this thing was maybe 25 feet behind us. I don't know. I'm really bad with guessing distances. But right after Frank yelled, it suddenly moved and its upper body expanded, and I swear to God, this thing had actual wings. These massive wings unfolded all of a sudden to what seemed to be 10 feet wide. It then gave a little hop and pushed the wings down, and it just launched itself. There's no other way to describe it. It just took off like a bird, even though it was the size of a man. It didn't come toward us, just up and up until it disappeared off to the side of the road where the woods were. Frank said, "Holy crap!" and I was just speechless. I mean, I've never been so scared in my life. The only thing I could think was that maybe it was a fallen angel, but that's just my Catholic upbringing, I guess. And anyway, this thing was dark, maybe even black, which wouldn't match an angel. I don't really believe in fallen angels. But then again, this thing was man-shaped and man-sized, and it was able to fly. I pulled out my phone right then, ready to call my sister and beg her to come get us. We don't really get along, and I didn't want to ask her for help, but I was just terrified. Frank grabbed my arm and said, "We got to keep walking." So here I am trying to dial the number and keep up the pace, and I couldn't get the call to go through. It rang a few times, but the signal must have been weak because it kept dropping the call. I gave up and just concentrated on walking as fast as I could. Frank looked behind us real quick, and I asked him if the thing had come back. I was too scared to look. He said no, but we kept up our pace. Then we saw some headlights, even though they were going in the wrong direction we wanted to go, coming toward us and not heading toward town. Frank said, "Let's cross and flag him down." I guess he was as spooked as me. I knew I would go just about anywhere to get away from here. So we crossed the road and it was a big truck. Frank waved his arms and thank God the guy stopped. We got in and Frank said we just need to go somewhere, anywhere, it doesn't matter where. He just told the guy we broke down. He didn't mention the thing with wings because he probably thought the trucker would boot us out, thinking we were lunatics. So the guy was really cool and said sure, he'd drop us at the next town. I figured if there was any place open, we could just hang out and decide what to do from there. We had only been traveling for about 5 minutes when all of a sudden, the truck's headlights showed this thing ahead of us, standing right in the middle of the road. The trucker swore and hit the horn, but the thing stayed right in the middle of the road till we got really close. The guy hit his brakes and blew the horn again, and the headlight beam shone right on the creature. It was all black except its face, which was gray. It was happening so fast I can't say for sure, but I didn't see a face on it, just red eyes in the headlights, right before it took off. I know it was the same thing that had been behind us, because it unfolded these big black wings and shot straight up, flying right over the damn windshield. The guy swerved, going, "What was that?" And I held on to Frank with a death grip, afraid we were going to jackknife and crash. The guy got it under control, though. But he must have been pretty shaken up, because he pulled off to the side of the road and sat gripping the steering wheel and breathing fast. That's when we told him that thing had been following us. The guy had no choice but to believe us then, because he'd seen it with his own eyes. He pulled back on the road and we talked about it all the way to the next town. Chad, the trucker, said he'd never seen anything like it before, but a trucker buddy of his had a similar experience, and based on that he thought it was the Mothman. Do you know if anyone's ever been hurt by a Mothman? Just wondering why it was following us and what would have happened if we hadn't gotten away. Before we get into the stories, I'm excited to announce I have a new channel called Monster Trail Cams. Here's a quick trailer for my new channel. The link is below. Monster Trail Cams is your ticket to the unseen and supernatural. Sourced from a vast network of mystery hunters worldwide, our channel reveals a collection of strange creatures and supernatural events that will leave you on the edge of your seat. From shadowy figures lurking in dense forests to inexplicable entities prowling under the cloak of night, each chilling clip peels back another layer of the world's untold mysteries. We release new episodes several times a week. Okay, now let's get to the stories. I'm a ranger in a national park, but I don't feel comfortable telling you where. I still work here and can get in a bunch of trouble. I have been here for 5 years and have never had an incident like this until now. A woman has gone missing, just completely disappeared, and we believe she was taken by a creature that we cannot identify. We literally don't know what it is, but we are quite sure that she was taken by something that seems to know its way around. We are guessing it knows the most remote areas of the park because both she and it are nowhere to be found. It's been 5 days now, and not a single shred of evidence has been found of her, other than her tent and a few belongings at her campsite. Strangely, there was no evidence of a struggle. She was just gone. Even her cook pan was on the fire, looking like she had been cooking when she disappeared. Also, some of her important belongings were still at her campsite, so we are convinced she didn't just leave on her own, at least not without meaning to return. We're not telling visitors what happened yet. We've been instructed to just say that we don't have any concrete details yet, and to ask for their help if they see anything. But I have this urge to go out there and tell people what we think is really going on. This is so scary. I hope she is okay. I normally wouldn't share the truth with the public like this, basically because we've been told not to and I could lose my job, but I feel like people should know what really happens here. It was actually her family that first notified us when they didn't hear from her for a few days. They said she normally would at least send a text once a day. We looked and found her name in our logs and headed out to where she was camping. And that's when we found the footprints, and no sign of her, and we instantly knew that something was wrong. I'll share with you now why we're instantly on alert. 3 years ago, almost these exact same set of circumstances happened, but we did find the remains of that camper. There were signs of a creature attacking and consuming him, including fur and certain marks on his body. I won't get into the gory part, but the creature left quite a bit of evidence behind that helped us know it wasn't human, including the exact same set of footprints found at this girl's site. We have never been able to find out what the creature exactly looks like, and we're hesitant to call in forensics experts as we don't really want this getting out there, but we're all really petrified knowing it is still out there. And now this woman has gone missing in the same way, and we have no idea where she is. The unknown is really what is hardest for me. I wish the higher-ups would just allow experts to come in and help us. I mean, who knows what this creature might do next? I'm scared it could come after one of us. Target and follow us while we're out searching for clues. We've been scouring the area for any sign of her, but we just can't find her. The only thing we have to go on is this creature's prints, which are huge. Some say that she wandered off and got lost, but I just don't believe that. She was a very experienced hiker and knew these woods like the back of her hand. And plus, if she had just wandered off, why was her gear left behind? Her family says there's no way she would have left without it. Being in the outdoors was her refuge, and her gear meant everything to her. So, what does this creature look like? We really don't know. But it's big and has a very strange footprint like I mentioned. I guess I'm fixated on the footprints, but it's true. I can't get them out of my mind. Some say it's a Sasquatch, but I highly doubt that. This creature is something else, something new that hasn't been identified yet. I think we've never seen anything like it before. Whatever it is, we need to find this creature and get it out of the area. It's not safe for anyone, especially not for the visitors who come here thinking they're in one of the safest places on Earth. I had a strange occurrence at my job. It seems like a lot of people wait a while before talking about this stuff, but I just need to get it off my chest. I've been having a hard time sleeping lately and can't decide what I should do, or if I should even do anything at all. About a few months ago, I started working at a dermatopathology lab as one of the lab techs. It's a pretty easy job. For anyone not familiar with this sector, basically, we analyze skin for diseases, fungi, cancers, etc. I was hired when a previous lab tech went on maternity leave, so my contract with the lab is for 6 months. This is a small, privately owned lab on the East Coast. Pretty rare since Quest is huge now and gets most of the work, but some doctors still pay for specialized services or an actual human eye on specimens. My job consists of intake and the initial sectioning of the specimens before they're put onto slides for the specialists to look at. Prior to this, I'd hopped around a few small labs throughout the state, but this lab isn't like any other. I don't mean that in a good way. It's pretty run down. From what I've been told, the owner and head specialist has owned the building since the early 90s. He's in his 60s now, but has no plans to retire, which he says constantly. There's supposedly a maintenance company that keeps up the place, but I haven't seen them once. The parking lot is pitted with potholes, panels in the ceiling are missing, 2 of the 4 toilets don't work, and the furnace wouldn't turn on this week when they tested it. Like I said, the lab is small, so there are only 8 other lab techs. I pried a little bit to see if anyone thinks this is an odd situation, but the only answer I get is that it pays well, and I should keep my head down. I've been working Monday through Friday every week, but I got called in this past Saturday due to a tech being unexpectedly out. They needed someone to process the specimens that had arrived Friday morning, and I live the closest, so I headed in. After punching in my alarm code and locking the door behind me, I headed down to the lower floor of the building. There's only one room on this floor that is actually used for lab work. The rest is very maze-like, with rooms opening to other rooms, no real hallways, and stacks upon stacks of old medical records. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of violations going on, but I'm not a whistleblower, and I only have 4 months left on the contract. So, on this particular Saturday, I hunkered down in the lab room and got to work. I'd made it about 2 hours in when I heard a thudding sound. There are so many machines around that I assumed it was just that, but I realized it wasn't rhythmic. It sounded human-made, and I tensed up thinking someone had gotten into the building or was trying to... I pulled out my cell phone and got the emergency number ready, but decided to at least check out my section of the downstairs. There's an exit door a few feet behind the room I work in, so I could easily escape if something weird was up. And the sound was definitely coming from down there. I would have heard anyone coming down the stairs, and I hadn't, so whatever was making the noise was already in the building. Stepping out into the single hallway, I looked up and down before deciding my best bet was to stop outside each door and listen. The first 2 doors didn't sound like the thudding was coming from in there. When I reached the 3rd door, the sound stopped for a moment before continuing. I passed the tiny kitchen and break room and reached a door that I remembered was the owner's library. The thudding was coming from inside, and now I could hear scratching too. I hesitated for a second before pushing the door open and flipping the light on quickly. Inside the room was empty, except for stacks and stacks of journals and books. But across the room on the other wall was another door. I stepped through the piles of journals, the hair on the back of my neck standing up, and listened at the door. The thudding and scratching was coming from inside. Double-checking that I had the emergency number up, I quietly pushed the door open. It looked like a normal door, but I was surprised by how insanely heavy it was. The room inside was shadowed with narrow windows up near the ceiling, but it was enough light that I could see a cage on a table in the room. The cage was about 4 feet by 4 feet, and inside was something that I can only describe as a huge anteater digging at a corner of the cage with its curved, scaly back turned toward me. My first thought was that for some reason someone had left this thing here by mistake. But what on earth was it? And who would do that? I got closer to it, and when it turned around, I saw that it had a face similar to a monkey. I stumbled back, and the creature turned quickly towards me, baring its teeth at me. None of this made sense to me at all. Like, what was this thing, and why was it here at all? Let alone in a cage in the lab over the weekend. I stepped out and shut the door quickly, trying to process what I'd just seen. Were they running experiments on this creature? It was definitely a crossbreed of some kind, not natural in any way. I quickly went back to the lab room and packed it in. I just left without doing any more work. The lab supervisor gave me a hard time about not finishing, but I said there'd been a family emergency. It's now been a while, and I'm still thinking about that creature downstairs. Do I say something to someone? Do I ask about it? Or is it a secret? No one else has mentioned the caged creature in that room, and I'm scared that I stumbled on something I shouldn't have. At this point, I don't know what to do, or if I should check if it's still down there. Someone must be feeding it and taking care of it, but I don't have a good feeling about what they're doing to it. I know this is going to sound unbelievable and ridiculous, but I swear every word of it is true. I was 15 years old when my parents sent me to the foothills of West Virginia to stay with my grandma for a while. I'd been getting into a lot of trouble back home in Massachusetts, and they thought some quiet time in the country with Grandma would do me some good. However, being there wasn't doing me any good. I was bored to tears and was already planning what I was going to do the minute I got back home to my friends. I guess Grandma could tell that I had a little spark of something mischievous in me because she woke me up early one morning to tell me that I needed to get up and get ready because we were off to an all-day church function. I was miserable all day. It was hot out, and I was surrounded by a bunch of people I didn't know. My grandma kept pushing me to talk to one girl in particular, telling me we'd be good friends. I don't know what made her think that, aside from the fact that we were relatively close in age. I could see that the girl and I had very little in common aside from our age, and I could also tell she was as unimpressed with me as I was with her. Grandma volunteered to stay late and help clean up, and of course I had to stay too. The only saving grace was that the girl she sent me to talk to had actually been interesting. Once we got relaxed with each other, she got to talking, telling me a couple of crazy stories about a local monster called a Mothman. The girl's name was Gwen, and she hadn't ever seen the Mothman herself, but she had heard a few long-winded tales from her uncles about times they spotted the thing down in the hollers, as she called them, and riverbeds surrounding town. According to her uncles, and told to me by way of her, the thing was anywhere between 6 and 10 feet tall, had glowing red eyes, and a wingspan at least as wide as its height. She said most commonly people would catch it out flying at night, swooping down at cars on the back gravel roads. I didn't believe her, of course. To me it was just a little bit of folklore, but it didn't get lost on me that Grandma's house was on a back gravel road. So I'd be lying if I said she didn't succeed in spooking me, at least a little bit. As it started to get darker out that night, I found myself more nervous about the drive home and started urging Grandma to hurry things along. By this time, we'd been at the church for well over 8 hours, and she had finished the cleaning and was sitting and was now having coffee, chatting with the pastor's wife, and catching up on local happenings as if there wasn't another care in the world. Finally, she picked up on my urgency to leave, and we made our way out to the car. I could tell she was a little annoyed with my impatience as she snarked back at me. "What has gotten into you?" I didn't want to tell her, of course, that the Mothman stories were getting to me. As we started home, though, she brought the creature up herself. "You know," she said, "it's best we took off anyway. We should have left earlier, probably. The Mothman is usually out on clear nights like this." I faked my best scoff and pretended not to know what she was talking about. She then told me that she had overheard Gwen telling me about him, and then proceeded to tell me that she had seen him herself at least 3 times. My grandma was a God-fearing, traditional, straight-laced old lady. There's no way in the world she would tell a lie, so at this point I started to get extra worried. And I know you won't believe this part of my story, but it's almost as if the thing knew we were talking about it, because right when Grandma stopped telling me about her 3rd sighting, she slammed on her brakes and screamed. This, of course, is where my heart started beating out of my chest. A screaming grandma caught my attention, and I looked ahead at the road to see what caused it. There it stood. It looked dark gray under the light of the headlights, and it was standing motionless in the road, staring at us. I didn't even have to utter the words and ask if it was what I thought it was. I just looked over at her, and she nodded and put out her arm, silently telling me to sit back and stay quiet. I wasn't about to argue with her, so I did exactly what she said. And that's when this hulking creature leaned forward, as if he was peering in through the windshield at us, and then opened its mouth to let out an ear-piercing screech. As it screeched, I watched as its wings spread out, followed by it, taking a giant leap, then flying over us and straight up over the trees that lined the road. With the road now clear ahead of us, Grandma jammed her foot on the gas, and we got home quicker than I ever thought she could drive, and we ran as fast as we could into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. The next week, my parents came and got me. It was time for the visit to come to a close anyway. And when I got back to Massachusetts, I was a completely different kid. I stayed out of trouble. I listened to my parents. I did everything I was told. And let me tell you that I now have a new fascination with my grandma and what she might really be capable of doing. Don't get me wrong. I love my grandma. It's just that before this, I only thought of her as older and slower. Either way, I don't ever want to be sent back to West Virginia to face that thing again. Grandma will just have to come to our house. And so I've got a story from about 6 or 7 years ago when I spent a weekend at Olympic National Park in Washington State. What we like about Olympic Park is that it's quieter than a lot of other parks. It's a great place for when you don't want to see many people. And we spent a lot of that weekend hiking and were able to have the place pretty much to ourselves. We also like that the hiking trails around there cut through these really old forests, right? We just essentially go and get lost in the trees. We only had 3 days there, though. Just a long weekend, so each day we'd leave early in the morning and not come back to our hotel until sunset. So it was the second day when this happened. Mike and I were a couple miles in and we hadn't seen another hiker for hours. Also, this was the farthest we'd gone on the trail so far, which is important because we had never been in this area before. We get to this spot where the trees are wide open. What I mean is that it's like it's just all these bushes and undergrowth on either side of the trail, not full-grown trees. And it's like this for at least 100 feet. And all of a sudden there's this stink. It's something sour, maybe, is the best way that I can describe it. My husband's ahead of me and he stops us. Mike thinks a skunk's been through there. But I don't, because we've dealt with skunks before and they don't smell like that. This was different. And he's asking me, well, if it's not that, then what is it? And I don't know what to say. And the thing is, we both wanted to turn back now because the smell was making us sick. But we also wanted to see what it was coming from. In the end, we decide to push a little further, and the ground then starts to get muddy. And in the mud, we can see that it looks like something heavy was dragged down the trail. And also, the bushes are messed up on either side. As we continue, the smell is now so bad that I cover my mouth to try and keep myself from puking. Then we get to this turning point in the trail and there's all this trash stuck in the bushes. Chip bags, burger wraps, that sort of thing. It's everywhere. And now the ground feels really sticky. We now figure that the smell is coming from this trash, but my brain also knows that it's not all adding up. I know what a full trash can smells like, but this is worse, and I'm trying to figure out why. Then we see that a trash can has been shoved deep in the bushes. It's laying on its side with flies buzzing all around it, and the stink is the strongest at this point. So, Mike holds his one arm over his mouth and walks over to it and rolls it a bit. We both start gasping and gagging at the same time. There's a whole deer stuffed inside, and it's got these huge chunks missing from its legs. It's all covered in dark, dried blood and is really slimy, like it's been there a while. So now we're at our limit and we turn around and start running to get away from both what we saw and also the stench. We're also pretty creeped out that someone killed this deer and shoved it in a trash can. Like, who does that kind of thing? So we quickly make our way back down the trail. I'm thinking and sort of hoping that there's got to be some more hikers back in these parts, but we're still alone. Now we're walking downhill and we can see the campground below. It's also basically a resting spot, too, for hikers coming down from above. So it's got benches and trash cans for hikers. We're maybe 50 feet up from it and looking down when I first see this big dark shape coming out of the forest off to the right of the campground and walking in our direction. At first I'm thinking it's a bear, because it's got all this dark fur and it's just huge. But then it stands up on its back legs only and we can see its face. This thing's at least 10 feet tall, even though it is slumped over and looks like a gorilla. It's got no neck and has a flat forehead, that sort of human shape to his face. And then it starts looking around like it's looking for something, so Mike and I duck behind a tree but sort of have our heads sticking out a butt so that we can see and figure this thing out. And I'm trying not to breathe too loud, right? Because it's an absolute beast. And now I'm thinking that this is 100% what took down that deer. I swear we watched it for forever as it wandered back and forth like it was looking around. It would even disappear for a bit, but then show back up again. And by then the sun was starting to set and I was worried we'd be stuck out there in the dark with that thing that I knew could navigate the night much better than us. But eventually it disappears again, but this time it doesn't reappear, and we start to feel a bit safer. Mike waited a long time before looking back down there. And still the beast was gone. We walked as fast as we could, hoping and praying the entire time to make it safely back to the front of the park. We were trying to decide if we should tell the park rangers at all, because we were worried it wasn't safe with that thing on the loose, but then again, it's the right thing to do, to at least tell someone about the litter and the dead deer. So I made a compromise with myself and decided to just tell the ranger we'd seen a bear and her cubs by one of the campgrounds, and it looked like they'd gotten into some food. He said he'd warn people to stay alert. Mike and I didn't go back into the park at all the final day of our weekend. In fact, we waited a few years before going back to the Olympic, and luckily we haven't seen any sign of that thing again. It still gives me the creeps. I've been working as a ranger in Harriman State Park in New York for about 5 years. Normally, my job entails tracking down lost hikers and busting kids with beer cans. If it's a slow day, I may just handle parking tickets or spend the afternoon at the base station. This whole summer, we'd been struggling with a boom in the black bear population. We've invested thousands of dollars in bear-proof dumpsters, hazing equipment, air horns, and training sessions for park staff. But these critters just can't stay away from our group camps and patrons. They can smell a barbecue from over a mile away, and even a spray of scented sunscreen can attract them to a camp. To make matters worse, many of our visitors don't clean up after themselves and leave their trash scattered all over the campground. Bears will dive deep into our dumpsters, break into kitchens, unlock cabinets, and sneak into outhouses. They can stand on their hind legs and climb up trees. Well, basically what I'm saying is that I know bears. They're mostly harmless, but if you get too close, you might be in trouble. I also know raccoons, and possums, and deer, and squirrels. I know what all the animals in this park look like and how they act. I know what I saw last week was not a normal animal. I was doing a routine drive down a park road when I noticed that the door to a camp mess hall was open and the dirt on the path was all scuffed up. Now this was odd because no one was supposed to be at this camp since the Girl Scouts left at the end of July. I figured it was either some teenagers with spray paint or maybe a maintenance worker. So I hopped out of my truck and started walking over to the cabin. As I got closer, I started to hear some weird noises. Something metal was clanking. Papers were being shuffled. It sounded like cans and boxes were falling off a shelf. Then I noticed the wet smacking sound of something eating. All right, I think to myself, okay, so I'm dealing with a bear, or maybe a family of raccoons. So I follow protocol. I pull out my walkie-talkie so I can call for backup from the rest of my team. But the second I begin to speak, whatever it is in there must have heard me, because now I hear a terrible howl from inside the cabin kitchen. I know better than to finish my call after hearing that, so I just ducked down behind a tree. You gotta know I'm not so proud of this, but you know I have got a family and kids at home, and I'm glad I hid because this creature starts to walk right out the door. My first glimpse was at its legs. They looked like tree trunks and were covered with a dense, dark brown fur. This thing was huge, taller than a grown man with broad shoulders and bulging muscles. In my first look, I thought it could have been a bear. But once I saw its face, I knew it was something else. It looked like a man in some ways, or maybe a gorilla, or maybe a wolf. Whatever it wasn't a bear. I know it couldn't have been. Its face was hairless and its forehead was protruding out. It looked mad. This thing walked right on out of the mess hall on two legs. It peered at my truck on the road, sniffed up into the air, swung its long arms, and ran. I tried to peer out to see where it went, but it was too fast. In a blink, it was gone. I dusted off my pants and finished calling my team. When they arrived at the camp, I started to tell them about what I'd seen. Everyone kept laughing at me and saying, "Oh, well, of course Kyle saw Bigfoot, huh?" No one wanted to believe me. But once we walked into the kitchen, they started to change their tune. The first thing that hit us was the smell. It was like we walked into a garbage dump that had been set on fire, and that fire was put out with skunk spray. I held my shirt up over my nose, but my pal David actually threw up once that stench hit him. Yep, true story there. The room was nearly destroyed. The refrigerator was flung open, and the contents were spilled all over the floor. Serves that camp right for leaving so much food in the cabin over winter, but bears can't open jars. They can't open cans. They can't smash open locked cabinets. All along the walls were scratch marks, and the whole place was a mess. It was a terrible sight. The floor was covered in a layer of pasta sauce, relish, and marshmallows. There was a loaf of bread with a huge bite missing out of it, right through the plastic. I picked it up off the counter, and then I immediately flung it back down. My fingers were covered in a sticky slobber, and I couldn't wipe it off quickly enough. In the mess of mustard and ketchup and spoiled milk on the floor, I could actually make out a full footprint. It looked like a normal man's foot in all the gunk, but it was 3 times as large as my shoe, and I'm a size 11. I think I really did see Bigfoot, or the Yeti, or whatever you want to call it. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. We're not going to patrol as solo anymore. Everyone is sticking with their partner. I think that we're better safe than sorry. That thing could take any of us, though. Even the bigger guys wouldn't stand a chance. My grandmother, a full-blooded Cree Indian, raised me and my sister. We lived near Hiawatha National Forest, which is part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Her family was from Canada, but I never got to meet my great-grandparents. From the time I was small, I remember her telling us girls that if we argued with each other too much, the Wendigo would steal our souls. Now, I understand parents and grandparents will say all sorts of things to get kids to behave, but this was different. We knew there was a Wendigo in the woods nearby. Sometimes when we were picking berries, my grandmother would take us out to a stone wall at the edge of the property and tell us to never, ever go past that boundary. The Wendigo had claimed that property, and if we respected his boundary, he would respect ours. She told us the Wendigo was a terrible creature, a monster who ate the flesh of humans. She said he smelled like a dead deer and stood 7 feet tall. But the most important thing she said was there was a covenant with the Cree people and the Wendigo, which meant he was bound to respect our borders, or fire would consume him from the inside out. Because of our heritage, we grew up with certain customs. When we had a plentiful harvest, my grandmother would pack a basket full of excess fruit or vegetables and leave it on top of the stone wall. She said the Wendigo would come and take it at night. I guess it was an offering, a reminder that we had a covenant. I was 12 years old before I ever saw it for myself. My sister was a year older than me, and we were arguing constantly at that age. Nothing my grandmother could say would convince us to get along. Then, on Valentine's Day that year, I got really angry. My sister came home with a box of chocolates from a boy I had a crush on. We got in a big fight and my grandmother sided with my sister. She told me to take my bad attitude up to my room without supper. I stewed about it for hours, scowling at my sister's empty bed and looking out the window at the moon. After a while, I got in my bed, but I was too angry to sleep. I was awake when my sister came in, and then I heard my grandmother go into her room and close her door. I waited, forming a plan born of spite. Once my sister's breathing was steady and even, I tiptoed over to her nightstand and stole the box of candy. I eased down the steps and put on my coat and my boots and let myself silently out the door. I remember it was a beautiful starry night. There was only a few inches of snow and it glittered under the moon. I crunched across the yard, clutching the stolen candy box and not allowing myself to think twice. Once I was in the woods, though, I started to get nervous. I stopped and listened, thinking I heard something crunching through the snow behind me. I looked but didn't see anything, so I walked on until I got to the stone wall. I crept up as quiet as I could be, which was not very quiet with boots in snow. I laid the candy box on the stone wall and walked away, a mean little glow of victory spreading in my misguided heart. Ha! Let the Wendigo eat her chocolates, I thought. And then I heard something terrible. A fierce growl, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. I slipped behind a tree, feeling entirely too exposed out there in the snow, like a target in my bright red coat. I listened, barely breathing, and suddenly I smelled a foul odor. It was the smell of death. I knew the Wendigo was nearby. My heart started pounding so hard, I was afraid the creature would hear it and find me. I wanted to run, but I didn't dare move out from behind the tree. I heard the snow crunch nearby, and a snuffling sound like a bear makes. I was so terrified my teeth were chattering, but I had to look. Slowly, carefully, I peeked around the side of the tree, praying it wouldn't see me. It was there, standing on the other side of the stone wall, just as my grandmother had described it. Hugely tall and powerful looking, standing up on two legs and covered in fur, all except for its head. The moonlight shone down on its head, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw the naked skull it had for a face, glowing red embers for eyes and terrible, wicked antlers protruding from its skull. This is embarrassing to admit, but I was only 12 after all. Seeing that monstrous creature only 20 paces or so away from me, I lost control of my bladder. Immediately, the thing turned its head, looking right at the tree I was hiding behind, and I knew it could smell me. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling lightheaded and dizzy. I knew I was about to faint for real. My grandmother saved me. A bright light shone through the woods, and I could hear her voice shouting my name. I was too afraid to speak, but I opened my eyes and saw the Wendigo turn its head, looking in her direction. With an angry snort through its nostrils, it stalked off into the woods. I huddled there against the tree, crying, still too afraid to move, and that's where my grandmother found me. I blubbered out my crime to her, expecting her to take a strap to me. She didn't, though. Maybe she thought I'd learned my lesson. She scolded me harshly and had me do my sister's chores for a week. I also had to apologize and spend my allowance to buy my sister a new box of candy. And the stolen box of chocolates? It was gone. Maybe the Wendigo took it, or maybe it knocked it all into the snow on the other side of the wall. I don't know. I never went back there looking for it. But I do remember as I confessed my shameful behavior, standing in the snow, my grandmother shone her light on the wall, and the box was gone. So if you're a disbeliever, know this. Just because you personally haven't seen a Wendigo doesn't mean they don't exist. There's plenty of us who have seen them. I got something interesting for you that still stumps me to this day. I love watching shows about the supernatural and am very intrigued by it, but haven't had too many experiences myself. This one experience really freaked me out though, so I'm not sure if I want another one. But at the same time, it does make life more interesting. I mean, there is so much out there that we will never know or fully understand. I'm a correctional officer and I've seen some crazy things in the prison. I'm sure you and your listeners can only imagine some of the stuff we see. We got this inmate a little while ago who was charged with rape and murder. He also had a track record of multiple counts of burglary and breaking and entering charges. Basically, he had an entire gamut of charges against him. But honestly, I never had too many issues with him. He was good at doing time and mostly kept to himself. He was a model inmate for most of his stay. Didn't cause any problems, didn't fight with any other inmates, and always treated me with respect. Then one day, a fellow officer barged into where I was doing paperwork and told me I had to see something immediately. We went up to this guy's cell, and his face had completely changed. He was snarling and drooling, and he had this evil smile on his face. Then he screamed, "No," and appeared to be fighting something inside himself. Finally, after squirming around the floor for a while, he returned to normal, apologized, got into bed, and didn't make a sound for as long as we stood there. The heckles and taunts were coming in from the nearby cells, but nothing made him stir. After this, I always looked at that guy differently and always had my guard up a bit, but he went right back to displaying perfectly normal behavior. I didn't have any incidents with this guy for about a week until one night I was walking by his cell and saw him writhing around on the floor again. His face had completely changed once again, but it was different from the face I saw the last time. This really freaked me out. Does this guy get possessed by a different demon every week or something? Eventually, he regained his composure, apologized, and got back into bed. This became a regular occurrence, and about once a week, a different demonic smile would greet me from the bars of his cell. I asked him about it to see if he had ever been treated for this psychological condition of his, and he told me that the affliction he suffered from couldn't be treated by medicine. He said that it had been happening to him since he was a child, and it was something he's always struggled with. He said that before, the demons would take over for days and sometimes weeks at a time. But now he was spiritually stronger and could defeat them much quicker. I told him to keep fighting the good fight and went on about my day. Now, this same prisoner would regularly visit the prison chaplain and was always kind, cooperative, and grateful to him. But shortly after his visits with the chaplain, another demon would try to take over his body. It was almost like the visits to the chaplain encouraged the demonic activity. One time I watched him having a fit, and the face that looked back at me had completely black eyes and a huge mouth. If this guy was just messing with us, he was a genius actor, but I believe him that he has demonic encounters. The faces this guy makes are enough to give anyone nightmares. Then one day when I was on my rounds, he didn't respond to me when I called his name. I suspected he was trying something shifty, so I called a couple of other officers in to help me investigate. Together we unlocked and entered the cell. He was laying on his bed facing the wall. I kept saying his name without any response, so I finally reached over and rolled him over. His face was frozen in one of his horrific faces, a smile with black eyes, and he was dead. I didn't show my fear to the other officers, but this shook me up. I started going to visit the prison chaplain myself to cover all my spiritual bases just in case. I told the chaplain all about it, and I think, in order to help me feel better, the chaplain shared with me that he too had recently started having these fits. Fits where he'd black out and wake up hours later and find himself someplace else. I asked him if it could be the same thing that the inmate suffered from, but he told me he felt it was just migraines. Then one day I saw the chaplain and I didn't recognize him at all. He was just sitting on the pew with this huge, unnatural smile on his face. I cautiously said hello to him, and he just looked at me silently with that smile. It was enough to make me continue on my way and get out of there. Then, I overheard some of the inmates talking one day, and they mentioned that since they started going to the chaplain, they started having intense headaches. I made a note to keep my eye on them and went about my day. Then one day, the chaplain quit suddenly, and we had to scramble to find a replacement. The new chaplain was very nice, but I often wonder what happened to the man who left. I couldn't help but hope that the demons in his head didn't get the best of him. Since then, I've moved and am working security at a shopping mall, and it's a much more chill job than the prison. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since, but those black eyes and smile still stick with me. Even if that inmate was a terrible human being, what a miserable way to die. It makes me wonder how many people are walking around possessed by something they can't control. He can't be the only one, can he? If anyone has dealt with possessions before, please let me know how you dealt with them. Should we have called an exorcist into the prison? Would it have gone away if he had seen the psychiatrist? These questions keep me up some nights. And believe it or not, of all the crazy things I had to deal with at the prison, that death weighs the heaviest on. I've lived in a small house in the middle of the woods for a long time now. There are all sorts of wildlife that I get to see every day that I never used to see when I was a child. It's so stimulating, and it reminds me of how vast and infinite the universe is daily. I do believe, however, that I would have seen a lot more wildlife and might also be dead if I didn't have a paranormal protector who looks after me. I know that sounds crazy, but check this out. One night shortly after I had moved in, a wolf was on the porch sniffing around and checking things out. I was freaked out and I peered out from the window waiting for him to leave. The wolf saw me, froze, and started growling at me. I didn't know what to do. All of a sudden it jumped up and snapped at the window, snarling viciously. It kept jumping up and trying to bite me through the closed window. A couple more times and he would have shattered the glass. Then all of a sudden I heard the wolf whimper like it had been hurt, and it ran off. I opened the front door, and it was nowhere to be found. I went back inside, and perched upside down by the window was a bat. It was obvious that I was going to have a lot of encounters with the surrounding wildlife living here. After that, the bat would perch by my window and look in at me every night around 8 o'clock or so. It got to the point that I would look forward to his visit and even started to prepare food and water for him. I built him a bat box that he could sleep in, and pretty soon that became his permanent home. All night he would flutter around eating insects and return to the window to look at me. I swear this bat is in love with me. When I look into his eyes, I can see him relax and settle there by the window. He is very protective of me, and anytime anything gets close to the window, he flies around threateningly and scares it off. He's even done it with some friends and family I've had over. My mom tells me to get rid of him, but I honestly love having him there. I don't know for sure if the wolf would have broken through the window and killed me, but it's possible that this bat saved my life. He's my guardian angel, perched by the window, letting me know I'm safe every night. A couple of months later, a family of bears was roaming around the property, and a big one came up on the front porch and started sniffing around. I slammed on the door and yelled loudly to scare it off, and it ran off towards the other bears. Then all three of them just stopped and stared at the house. I kept yelling and pounding on the door, trying to get them to run away, but they just kept staring. Then all of a sudden they just charged at the house and started roaring. One jumped up and pounded on the door, the other one bashed the window in, and another one ran around the side. I immediately ran into the bedroom, locked the door, and called 911. I alerted the operator of what was going on, and he said that help was on the way. I heard the bears roaring and breaking things, and then all of a sudden I heard them whimpering. There was silence shortly afterward. I waited a couple of minutes and opened the door. The house was a wreck, and a bear was lying in the middle of the living room in a pool of blood. I slowly walked over to it and noticed a huge gash on the neck. The bear was dead and bleeding all over the place. I opened the front door and looked around for the other two bears, but they were nowhere to be found. The police came shortly after that and found the other bears dead in the woods nearby with neck wounds. The officer said it was a bite, and it was most likely the same animal that killed all bears. They told me I was extremely lucky and that I should get a shotgun to defend myself in the future. Shortly after they left, the bat perched by the window and looked in at me. It seemed impossible, but I couldn't help but feel that the bat had saved my life again. If it wasn't my supernatural protector, Then what else could have taken on 3 bears? I feed the bad insects, fruit, and the occasional baby mouse, and every night he looks in on me. I know his secret, though. He's not just a bat. He's my protective vampire, and nothing anyone says will convince me otherwise. I hope one day he will reveal his true form to me and trust that I will keep his secret. But until then, I will keep taking care of the bat that loves and protects me. Does anybody know of a way to get a vampire to reveal itself? I've got to admit, I really didn't want to talk about this, but maybe it's time I get this all out. So this all started during my friend Deanna's bachelorette party. We'd all decided to surprise her with a beach trip over at the Jersey Shore. It was all just cute girly stuff that we'd been planning for like months. Matching ribbons, pink wine glasses, and selfie props. But it wasn't. We'd been partying on the beach all day, and when we got back to the Airbnb, we remembered we'd left a cooler down on the beach, so I volunteered to run out and grab it. I was walking with my phone flashlight, but basically everything was pitch black. I saw a beam of light out in the distance on the ocean. Sort of like a police helicopter beam, you know? I thought it was odd, but I kept making my way down the beach. Then I saw it, just like this disgusting figure staring back at me. At first, I thought it was a man, but there was something deeply wrong with it. It was too tall, too skinny. Its head was too big. Its body was frail, and its eyes were a deep black. There was something behind those eyes, and I felt them sort of pull me. Even though I knew better, there was something about it that drew me closer. I just kept on walking closer and closer. Soon enough, I was around 15 feet from this thing. The skin was smooth, like a dolphin, but with bulging veins all over. At the end of its skinny arms were long, thin fingers that wouldn't stop moving. They looked like jellyfish tentacles. If it weren't for that massive head, it would almost look human, although someone extremely malnourished with knobby knees. Soon enough, I was only 10 feet away, and I realized that this thing had no mouth or nose, just an empty space where they should be. All this time, those deep black eyes were deadlocked straight on me. I felt a ringing in my ears that began to grow sharper and louder with each step forward. The sound vibrated in my skull and surrounded me completely. It started to turn into a low hum. The figure began to vibrate a bit as well, and I couldn't look away from those piercing eyes. Even though I was initially scared and confused, the sound started to calm me. It sounded like a terrifying lullaby, and I felt hypnotized as I crept closer and closer. Suddenly, a bright white light began to shine down from the sky. It blinded me for a moment, so I bent down and covered my eyes with my hands. After the initial shock of the white flare, I peered out from my fingers. The creature was gone, and the beach was pitch black yet again. I used my phone flashlight one more time to scan the area, but I couldn't see anything besides the sand, the dunes, and the steadily rolling waves. I took a deep breath and immediately regretted it. There was a strong stench, almost like rotting eggs and mulch. I couldn't see anything that could have caused this smell, so I think it could have been from the thing I saw. Once I regained my composure, I turned around and walked back to the Airbnb. The girls asked me what took me so long and why I didn't grab the cooler, but I just needed to go to my room and be alone. They told me I'd been gone for over an hour and had been walking up and down the beach looking for me. It only felt like a few moments out on that beach, and I definitely didn't hear or see anyone else out there. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat there staring at the ceiling the entire night, and in the morning, I decided to leave the girls' trip early to head home. My friends were sad to see me go, but I just couldn't explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy. I wanted to just forget about the creature. I wanted to just leave it on the beach and carry on like normal, but every time I closed my eyes to go to sleep, all I could see were those black eyes peering back at me. A few times I woke up sweating as I was shaken by a piercing hum. This carried on for a full week, and then one night, it just stopped. It took me another few weeks to really acknowledge what I had seen, but eventually I began a deep dive on Google to try to figure out what it could have been. After reading about 1,000 blog posts, 100 wiki threads, and 1,000,000 dead ends, I came to terms with the fact that I'd seen an alien. There have been a few sightings here on the East Coast, especially on the shore. That bright beam of light must have been its ship. I'm thinking of going back down to the beach. I'm not scared. The longer I think about it, the more certain I am that there are more of its kind out there and more coming.